What does it feel like to be absolutely certain that everything will go according to plan, so certain that you never pause to imagine another ending at all? What happens when the world's safest ship begins to sink so quietly that almost no one believes it at first? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early spring of 1912, certainty was everywhere. It was in the newspapers, in the advertisements pasted across railway stations, and in the calm routines of men who had crossed oceans so many times that the sea had long since become familiar rather than feared. Europe stood at the height of its confidence. The Edwardian world moved with measured steps, supported by empire, industry, and the belief that progress, once achieved, would naturally continue. Steamships had grown larger and faster with every passing decade. Crossing the Atlantic was no longer an adventure in the old sense. It was a scheduled service. Ships departed on time, arrived on time, and carried the world's business, mail, and people between continents with remarkable regularity. The ocean had not changed, but human expectations had. The White Star Line understood this better than most. Its ships were not built to chase speed records. They were designed for steadiness, comfort, and prestige. The company's leadership believed that travellers, especially wealthy ones, preferred reliability and refinement over raw speed. Titanic was meant to embody that philosophy completely. She was not only a vessel but a statement of industrial strength, of national pride, and of modern assurance. In Southampton, where Titanic prepared for her maiden voyage, this confidence showed itself in small, ordinary ways. Dock workers went about their tasks without ceremony. Supplies were loaded, coal was shoveled, mail was sorted. The ship lay at the quay not like a marvel demanding attention, but like a large, well-organised building that happened to float. She was impressive, certainly, but she was also familiar in purpose. This was how modern travel worked now. Passengers began arriving in ones and twos, carrying luggage rather than anticipation. For many, this was not their first Atlantic crossing. Some had chosen Titanic specifically because of her reputation for comfort. Others simply followed schedules arranged by agents and companies. There was no sense of participating in history. People expected a journey, not a story. Among the crew, routines governed everything. Officers checked lists and orders. Engineers reviewed systems. Stewards memorized cabin assignments. Each man had a defined role, and the success of the voyage depended not on inspiration but on repetition, doing what had been done before, again and again, with steady hands. Captain Edward John Smith arrived with the quiet authority of experience. Known as the millionaire's captain, he had spent decades at sea and was nearing retirement. This voyage was meant to be a fitting capstone to a long, dependable career. He had commanded ships through storms and fog, through crowded shipping lanes and quiet nights. Nothing about Titanic suggested that this crossing would be different from the many others he had overseen. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, moved through the vessel with a different awareness. He knew every compartment, every bulkhead, every calculation. He was not anxious, but he was attentive. Titanic was his work made real, and like any careful engineer, he remained interested in how theory met practice. His presence on board was routine for a maiden voyage, not an omen. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, also travelled aboard. His role was both executive and symbolic. He represented the company's confidence in its newest ship. His presence was meant to reassure, not supervise. This was not a trial run in the experimental sense. Titanic was already considered complete. Around them, the social world of the ship assembled itself. First-class passengers arrived with trunks and expectations shaped by luxury hotels rather than travel hardships. Second-class travellers represented professionals, academics, and clergy people, comfortable enough to expect privacy, but practical enough to appreciate value. Third-class passengers, many of them emigrants, carried fewer belongings but heavier hopes. They were not tourists. They were moving their lives. The divisions between these groups were clear, enforced by architecture as much as by policy. Corridors, staircases, and public rooms guided people where they belonged. This was not seen as cruelty or injustice at the time, but as order. Everyone knew their place, and the system worked because it was rarely questioned. As departure day approached, no one spoke of danger. The North Atlantic in April was known to be cold, and ice was a seasonal consideration, but it was not extraordinary. Ships had encountered ice for decades and adjusted accordingly. Wireless technology now allowed warnings to be shared. Experience suggested that risks could be managed. The phrase unsinkable was sometimes used in promotional language, but it was not a technical claim. It referred to the ship's advanced safety features, watertight compartments designed to limit flooding. In practice, this contributed to confidence rather than recklessness. It reassured passengers and crew alike that problems, if they arose, would remain contained. This sense of containment extended beyond engineering. Life itself felt contained, predictable, governed by systems that had proven themselves effective. The Edwardian world valued order. Disruptions were thought to be temporary. Disasters belonged to the past or to places far away. On the evening before departure, Titanic rested quietly at the dock. Lights glowed along her decks. Inside, final adjustments were made. Beds were prepared. Dining rooms stood ready. There was nothing tense in the air, nothing dramatic. If anything, there was a mild sense of anticipation, similar to the night before a long train journey. Families in Southampton went about their routines unaware that history had moored itself just offshore. Letters were written, meals eaten, conversations held that would not be remembered. The ship was present, but its future meaning had not yet formed. This is how large events often begin, not with warnings or signs, but with normality so complete that it feels unremarkable. Titanic did not depart into uncertainty. She departed into confidence shared by nearly everyone connected to her. That confidence shaped every decision that followed, not because people were careless, but because they were accustomed to success. By the time the final paperwork was completed and the last cargo secured, there was no sense of urgency. The ship was ready, the crew was ready, the passengers were ready. The Atlantic waited as it always had, wide and indifferent. What mattered most on that quiet night before departure was not what people knew, but what they assumed. They assumed that systems would hold, that experience would guide them, and that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to require no special thought. And with those assumptions firmly in place, Titanic prepared to sail, building a floating world. Titanic did not begin as a ship, she began as a response. At the turn of the 20th century, the North Atlantic was the busiest maritime corridor in the world. Millions of people crossed it every year, along with mail, capital and influence. Steamship companies competed not only for passengers, but for prestige. A liner was an advertisement that floated. Size, comfort and reliability mattered as much as speed, sometimes more. The White Star Line watched this competition carefully. Its rival, Cunard, had recently introduced two fast, powerful ships, Lusitania and Mauretania, that captured public attention with their speed records. White Star chose a different path. Rather than racing across the ocean, it would dominate it with scale and comfort. The plan was deliberate. Build ships so large and well-appointed that speed would become secondary. From that decision came the Olympic-class liners, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. Titanic was the second of the three, and in many ways the most emblematic. She was conceived not as an experiment, but as a refinement, a culmination of existing practice brought to its logical extreme. Her construction began at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, a place already accustomed to large steel vessels. Even so, Titanic required adjustments. Gantries were reinforced. New tools were installed. Thousands of workers were employed, each specializing in a narrow task: riveting, plating, wiring, fitting interiors. The ship rose piece by piece, not as a single vision, but as a coordinated effort spread across months. From the outside, Titanic was impressive by any measure. She stretched over 880 feet in length. Her hull rose high above the waterline, her funnels visible from miles away. But what mattered more to her builders lay inside: the systems designed to make her safe, stable, and comfortable. The hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by bulkheads fitted with doors that could be closed remotely from the bridge. This feature was widely promoted and genuinely innovative. In theory, the ship could remain afloat even if several compartments flooded. It was not invulnerable, but it was resilient, at least according to the calculations available at the time. Those calculations were based on known risks and known patterns. They did not imagine damage extending across too many compartments at once. They assumed collisions would be localized, as most had been in the past. The ocean, though vast, was treated as a space governed by precedent. Titanic's engines reflected similar thinking. She used a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine, an arrangement intended to balance power and efficiency. The system was reliable rather than cutting-edge. Engineers valued familiarity. At sea, novelty was often a liability. The boilers that fed those engines consumed enormous amounts of coal, several hundred tons per day. Teams of firemen worked below decks, shoveling continuously in hot, enclosed spaces. Their labour was unseen by most passengers, but it was constant. The ship's smooth progress depended on it. Above the machinery spaces, Titanic transformed into something else entirely. Public rooms were designed to resemble grand hotels rather than ships. Wood panelling, upholstered furniture, electric lighting, and wide staircases created an atmosphere of permanence. This was intentional. White Star wanted passengers to forget they were at sea. First-class accommodations received the most attention. The dining saloon could seat hundreds. The grand staircase served not just as a means of movement, but as a symbol, an interior centerpiece meant to impress. There were reading rooms, lounges, a gymnasium, even a swimming bath. None of this was necessary for crossing the Atlantic, but all of it contributed to the idea that Titanic was not merely transportation. She was an experience. Second-class spaces were more modest but still comfortable, surpassing first-class standards on older ships. Third-class areas, though plainer, were cleaner and better ventilated than those found on many competitors. White Star prided itself on humane conditions, particularly for emigrants. Every element reflected assumptions about order and separation. Passengers would move within designated spaces. Crew would serve from behind the scenes. Systems would function quietly. Problems, if they occurred, would be handled discreetly. Safety equipment followed regulatory standards of the time. Lifeboats were provided according to tonnage, not passenger capacity. Titanic carried more boats than legally required, yet far fewer of them would be needed for everyone on board. This was not seen as negligence. It was accepted practice. Lifeboats were intended to ferry passengers to safety, not to act as prolonged shelters. This logic depended on another assumption, that in a serious emergency, help would arrive. The North Atlantic was busy. Ships were rarely alone. Wireless communication, still relatively new, strengthened this belief. Distress signals could now be sent and received quickly. The sea felt smaller. Construction proceeded with confidence. Inspections were passed. Adjustments were made. Titanic was launched into the water in May 1911, her hull sliding down the ways into Belfast Lough. The event drew crowds, but it was not dramatic. Launches were routine at Harland and Wolff. The real work continued afterward. Outfitting took months. Interiors were completed, systems tested, crew selected. Nothing suggested urgency. The ship was built to last, not to rush. By early 1912, Titanic was ready for sea trials. These tests were brief, focusing on maneuverability and basic performance. The ship handled well. Her engines responded as expected. There was no reason to delay her entry into service. When Titanic sailed to Southampton to prepare for her maiden voyage, she joined a long tradition of liners beginning their working lives quietly. There were no speeches, no ceremonies. She was a commercial vessel entering service, not a monument. The phrase, floating world, was sometimes used to describe ships like Titanic, and it was not entirely metaphorical. She contained her own hierarchy, her own routines, her own rhythms. Once underway, she would operate independently, governed by maritime law and internal discipline. What mattered most about Titanic's construction was not any single feature, but the way all those features reinforced a shared belief that complexity equaled control. More compartments, more systems, more redundancies, all pointed toward mastery over risk. This belief was sincere. It was supported by decades of successful crossings. Accidents happened, but rarely on this scale. Each improvement seemed to reduce danger further. There was no sense that limits were being approached. In hindsight, it is tempting to see warning signs in the ship's design choices, in the height of the bulkheads, in the number of lifeboats, in the confidence of promotional language. But at the time, these choices aligned with industry norms and expert opinion. Titanic was not built recklessly. She was built carefully, methodically, according to the best understanding available. Her builders believed they were solving problems, not creating them. And so, by the time she stood complete, Titanic represented something larger than herself. She embodied the Edwardian faith in engineering, organization, and gradual improvement. She was proof, it seemed, that the age of catastrophic maritime disasters was drawing to a close. The floating world was ready. The people who ran her. A ship the size of Titanic did not run itself. Steel and steam mattered, but they were only as effective as the people who directed them. Long before the vessel left Southampton, a structure of authority, habit, and expectation was already in place. It was this human system, quiet, layered, and rarely questioned, that guided Titanic from her first casting off until the final minutes of the voyage. At the top of that structure stood Captain Edward John Smith. He was 62 years old in 1912, a man whose career had followed the rise of steamship travel itself. Smith had gone to sea as a boy, advanced steadily, and earned a reputation not for brilliance or daring, but for steadiness. White Star Line valued this quality. Their passengers, many of them wealthy and cautious, preferred a captain who inspired calm rather than excitement. Smith's authority on board was complete, but it was exercised gently. He was not known for issuing sharp orders or asserting himself unnecessarily. Instead, he relied on routine and trust. His officers were experienced men, accustomed to autonomy within clearly defined limits. On a ship like Titanic, the captain did not micromanage. He supervised a system that largely ran itself. Directly beneath him were the deck officers. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, recently transferred from Olympic, served as Smith's second-in-command. Wilde was a practical seaman, quiet and competent, with years of experience on large liners. His presence reinforced continuity between Titanic and her older sister ship. First Officer William Murdoch handled much of the day-to-day navigation. Murdoch was widely respected, known for his professionalism and decisiveness. He had served on several White Star vessels and understood the company's expectations thoroughly. His role placed him at the centre of operational decisions, course adjustments, speed, watch schedules. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, meticulous and rule-oriented, brought a different temperament. He believed strongly in order and adherence to procedure. His sense of duty was rigid, shaped by years at sea and a belief that discipline was the foundation of safety. He trusted the system because he was part of the system. 3rd through 6th officers filled out the watch rotations. Each man knew his place and his responsibilities. None of them were new to ocean travel. For them, Titanic was larger and more luxurious than previous ships, but the principles remained the same. Beyond the bridge, another hierarchy governed the engine rooms. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell oversaw the mechanical heart of the ship. His domain lay deep below the waterline, far from passenger spaces. Bell was responsible for ensuring that boilers, engines, and electrical systems functioned smoothly. His world was one of gauges, pressure, and routine maintenance. He and his engineers measured success by consistency, steady revolutions, even temperatures, predictable performance. Under Bell worked a large team of engineers, greasers, firemen, and trimmers. Firemen shoveled coal into the furnaces hour after hour, maintaining the steam that powered the ship. Trimmers worked in the coal bunkers, moving fuel to where it was needed. These men laboured in heat and darkness, largely invisible to passengers. Their work was physically demanding, repetitive, and essential. They were accustomed to hardship. Many had worked on ships where conditions were worse. Titanic's size did not make their jobs easier, but it did make them more organised. Shifts were scheduled, tasks defined. Like the officers above, these men relied on routine. Parallel to the Maritime command structure ran the hotel staff. Chief Steward Hugh McElroy managed the service side of the ship. His responsibilities included dining, cabins, cleaning, and passenger comfort. Hundreds of stewards, stewardesses, cooks, bakers, and waiters answered to him. For these crew members, Titanic was a workplace shaped by social expectation. First-class service demanded discretion, speed, and politeness. Second class required efficiency and attentiveness. Third class involved managing large numbers of people with limited shared language. Each group of passengers was treated differently because that was how travel was structured at the time. This division extended to movement around the ship. Crew corridors, stairways, and service lifts allowed staff to operate without intruding on passenger spaces. The ship functioned like a city with restricted districts. Everyone understood where they could go and where they could not. Thomas Andrews occupied an unusual position. As managing director of Harland and Wolff's design department, he was neither crew nor passenger. His role was observational. He inspected fittings, noted adjustments, and monitored performance. Andrews was methodical and reserved. He believed in precision and continuous improvement. He did not assume perfection, but he trusted design principles supported by calculation. J. Bruce Ismay's presence carried a different weight. As chairman and managing director of White Star, he represented corporate interests. Ismay was not involved in navigation or engineering decisions directly, but his authority was implicit. Officers were aware of his position. At the same time, maritime tradition placed ultimate responsibility with the captain. The boundaries between influence and command were understood, but rarely tested. Wireless operators formed another distinct group. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked for the Marconi Company, not White Star Line. Their primary duty was transmitting passenger messages, not monitoring ice reports. Wireless communication was still viewed as an auxiliary service rather than a navigational tool. The operators worked long hours, sending and receiving signals, often under pressure to clear backlogs. This separation mattered. Information flowed through channels defined by custom, not urgency. Ice warnings were received, logged, sometimes passed on, sometimes delayed. No single person was responsible for synthesizing all available data. Instead, information moved in fragments. What unified all these roles was trust in the established order. Each man believed that if he performed his duty correctly, the whole would function smoothly. This belief was reinforced by experience. Most Atlantic crossings ended uneventfully. Problems arose, but they were handled. There was no culture of anticipating catastrophe. Training focused on routine emergencies, fire, mechanical failure, minor collisions. Lifeboat drills existed, but they were procedural rather than rehearsed. Crew members knew where boats were and how to lower them, but few had practiced under realistic conditions. This was not complacency in the modern sense. It was proportionality. Extreme scenarios were considered unlikely. Preparing extensively for them seemed unnecessary, even disruptive. The officers trusted the ship, the engineers trusted the machinery, the stewards trusted the order of service, the wireless operators trusted the flow of messages. Each layer reinforced the others. Even social dynamics reflected this structure. Passengers deferred to officers, crew deferred to rank. Decisions moved downward, not upward. Questioning authority was rare, not because people were intimidated, but because the system had worked for so long. On the bridge, watch schedules rotated smoothly. Officers monitored speed, course, and weather. Orders were given and acknowledged. Logs were kept. Everything appeared stable. Below decks, the rhythm of labour continued uninterrupted. Boilers roared, engines turned, lights glowed. Electric power flowed throughout the ship, reinforcing the sense of modern reliability. In passenger spaces, the crew's presence was designed to be unobtrusive. Stewards moved quietly, anticipating needs. Service appeared effortless. This invisibility was intentional. It supported the illusion that comfort was natural, not manufactured. What none of these people could see, what no one was trained to imagine, was a failure that exceeded the system's assumptions. The possibility that multiple safeguards might be overwhelmed at once did not fit into existing categories. Responsibility was distributed, but accountability was diffuse. Everyone knew their job, but no one was tasked with imagining the unthinkable. This was not negligence. It was how large organizations functioned in an era that trusted structure over speculation. As Titanic moved closer to departure, these human systems settled into place as firmly as the steel beneath them. The ship was staffed by professionals doing what they had done many times before. Experience bred confidence, and confidence discouraged doubt. In later years, individuals would be scrutinized, praised, or blamed. Actions would be dissected, decisions questioned. But before the voyage began, there was no sense of impending judgment. There was only the steady continuation of routine. The people who ran Titanic believed in order, hierarchy, and competence. They believed that the sea could be managed through experience and technology. They believed, above all, that tomorrow would follow today in a predictable line. And with that belief guiding them, they prepared to sail. Passengers, classes, and expectations. When Titanic prepared to sail, she carried more than people from one continent to another. She carried assumptions about class, comfort, order, and what travel was supposed to feel like in the early 20th century. These assumptions shaped how passengers moved, where they slept, how they were served, and, most importantly, what they expected from the ship and from one another. The passenger list itself reflected the world as it existed in 1912. Wealth was concentrated, social mobility was limited, and the Atlantic crossing connected two centres of economic gravity. Those who boarded Titanic did so with different reasons and different futures in mind, but they shared a belief that the voyage would be routine. First-class passengers occupied the most visible and celebrated spaces on the ship. Many were industrialists, financiers, diplomats, and their families. Some were well known in business or society, others were simply affluent enough to afford the fare. For them, Titanic was not a challenge or an ordeal. It was an extension of a lifestyle already defined by comfort and predictability. Their cabins were spacious, some arranged as private suites with sitting rooms and private baths. The furnishings echoed grand hotels on land, polished wood, soft carpets, electric lighting that could be adjusted at will. There was no sense of improvisation in these spaces. Everything suggested permanence. Meals were served at fixed hours in a dining saloon designed to impress without overwhelming. Service followed formal rules, multiple courses, proper attire, attentive but discreet waiters. The emphasis was on calm regularity. Nothing was meant to surprise. Public rooms offered places to read, write letters, or walk slowly beneath glass-domed ceilings. The grand staircase functioned as both a thoroughfare and a social stage. People saw and were seen there, reinforcing shared expectations of behaviour. Movement was measured, voices were kept low, the sea remained largely outside awareness. Second-class passengers lived a different version of the same idea. Many were professionals, teachers, clergy, engineers, writers, or families travelling for business or relocation. Their accommodations were simpler but still comfortable. Cabins were smaller, often shared, but clean and well-maintained. Second-class dining was orderly and respectable. Meals were fewer in number but substantial. Service was efficient rather than ceremonial. These passengers expected courtesy and reliability, not indulgence. For them, Titanic represented value and modernity rather than luxury. Third-class passengers formed the largest group. Many were emigrants heading toward new lives in North America. They came from across Europe and beyond, speaking dozens of languages. Some travelled alone, others with families. Their possessions were limited to what they could carry or afford to ship. Conditions in third class reflected both progress and constraint. Compared to older emigrant ships, Titanic offered better ventilation, cleaner spaces, and regulated accommodations. Cabins were grouped by gender and family status. Shared facilities were common. Privacy was minimal. Even so, these passengers did not expect hardship. The crossing was part of a larger plan work, family reunification, opportunity. The ship was a means, not an experience. They trusted that it would deliver them safely, as countless ships had done before. What separated these classes was not only comfort, but access. Corridors, stairways, and doors controlled movement. Regulations, some mandated by immigration law, others by custom, kept groups apart. This separation was not viewed as hostility. It was accepted structure. Crew members enforced these boundaries routinely. Stewards directed passengers politely but firmly. Signs guided movement. Most passengers complied without question because the system aligned with what they already knew. This structure shaped expectations during the voyage. First-class passengers expected to be informed discreetly if anything unusual occurred. Second-class passengers expected instructions. Third-class passengers expected to follow orders when given. These expectations were rarely articulated, but they existed nonetheless. Social interactions reflected the same pattern. People tended to remain within their class group. Encounters across boundaries were limited and formal. Shared decks existed, but habits kept people apart. The ship itself reinforced this. Promenade decks were divided, dining rooms were separate, even the view of the sea varied depending on location. Titanic was a single vessel containing multiple social worlds. Before departure, excitement took different forms. In first class, anticipation focused on comfort and novelty. New spaces, new acquaintances, a pleasant passage. In second class, there was satisfaction in travelling well. In third class, there was hope and nervousness about what awaited at the other end. Yet across all classes, there was a common assumption that the journey itself would pass without incident. Crossing the Atlantic had become normalised. Stories of disaster belonged to earlier eras or exceptional circumstances. Titanic's reputation reinforced this belief. She was new, large, and widely regarded as safe. Passengers had no reason to question that assessment. Most did not study technical details. They trusted the company, the crew, and the broader system of modern travel. Even small inconveniences were interpreted through this lens. Delays, minor bumps, or changes in schedule were accepted as part of complex operations. not as signs of danger. People adjusted expectations slightly, not fundamentally. Cultural habits played a role. In 1912, authority figures were trusted more readily than they might be today. Captains, officers, and uniformed staff represented expertise. Their calm reassured passengers, and passengers rarely demanded explanations. This trust was reinforced by routine. Meals were served on time, lights stayed on, engines hummed steadily. The absence of visible problems became proof that none existed. Children moved through these spaces differently. In first and second class, they were supervised but allowed to explore. In third class, they stayed closer to family. For them, the ship was a temporary environment governed by adults' rules. Their experiences reflected the larger structure without challenging it. As the ship prepared to leave port, farewells took place along predictable lines. First-class passengers were seen off by acquaintances. Third-class passengers said goodbye to relatives who would not travel with them. Emotions varied, but none were connected to fear of the voyage itself. Titanic's scale made individual passengers feel small, but not vulnerable. The ship's size suggested security. Being one among many felt safer than travelling alone. This perception mattered. When people believe they are protected by systems larger than themselves, they are less likely to question those systems. Titanic inspired that belief easily. The ship's promotional language emphasized stability, comfort, and modern engineering. It did not dwell on risk. Passengers absorbed this tone unconsciously. They expected smoothness, because smoothness was promised everywhere. Even the concept of class aboard Titanic served a stabilizing function. It created predictability. People knew where they belonged and what to expect. That sense of order reduced anxiety and reinforced trust. As departure approached, passengers settled into cabins, explored decks, and adjusted to shipboard life. These actions were practical, not symbolic. No one sensed transition into danger. The voyage had not yet begun in earnest. The separation of classes would later complicate evacuation and survival, but at this stage, it simply reflected the world as it was. No one imagined that social boundaries would matter in an emergency. Emergencies, after all, were not expected. Titanic's passengers boarded with confidence shaped by experience, culture, and design. Their expectations were reasonable within the context of their time. They trusted the ship to carry them forward, not to test them. And with those expectations firmly in place, the passengers prepared for departure, each group inhabiting its own version of the same floating world. Sailing from Southampton. On the morning of the 10th of April, 1912, Southampton was awake long before Titanic was ready to leave. The port city had lived with ships for generations, and departures followed familiar rhythms. Trains arrived on schedule. Porters moved steadily along platforms. Dock workers checked manifests and cargo lists. Nothing about this day suggested that it would be remembered differently from hundreds of others. Titanic lay alongside the White Star dock, her hull towering above the quay. From nearby streets, her presence was impossible to ignore, yet it did not stop traffic or silence conversation. Large ships had become part of the city's landscape. People noticed her size, but they did not pause their lives for it. Passengers arrived in waves. First-class travellers often came by private car or taxi, accompanied by porters who managed their luggage. Their movements were calm and unhurried. Tickets were checked, cabins assigned, trunks tagged and sent below. There was no sense of rushing. Time felt abundant. Second-class passengers arrived mostly by train. They moved with purpose, carrying smaller bags and following signs. Some paused to look up at the ship. Others focused on finding the correct gangway. Conversations were practical about cabins, meals, and schedules waiting on the other side of the ocean. Third-class passengers arrived earlier than most. Immigration regulations required processing and inspection before boarding. Many had travelled long distances just to reach Southampton. They waited patiently. Families grouped together. belongings close at hand. Their mood mixed anticipation with uncertainty, but not fear of the ship itself. Crew members boarded separately, reporting to assigned stations. Stewards checked lists and supplies. Engineers reviewed engine room readiness. Officers rotated watches and verified orders. The ship was transitioning from static object to working system. Mail was loaded in bulk. Titanic carried thousands of letters and parcels, part of the Royal Mail Service. Sorting rooms deep inside the ship were already active, clerks preparing to work throughout the voyage. Communication mattered as much as transportation. The ship was a link in a global network. Coal had been loaded over several days, hundreds of tons transferred into bunkers along the hull. The process was dirty and labour-intensive, leaving marks on the ship's sides that would later be noticed in photographs. To those involved, it was simply part of preparation. By late morning, boarding was largely complete. Passengers settled into cabins. Stewards assisted with unpacking. Some explored decks and public rooms. Others remained inside, adjusting to the unfamiliar stillness of a ship not yet underway. On the bridge, officers monitored activity below. Captain Smith arrived on board and reviewed final details. There were no speeches, no formal send-offs. Authority expressed itself quietly, through readiness rather than announcement. At noon, Titanic prepared to depart. Lines were readied. Tugs waited to assist with manoeuvring in the confined space of the dock. The ship's size made departure a precise operation, not a dramatic one. As lines were cast off, an unexpected moment occurred. Titanic's engines engaged slowly, and as her massive hull began to move, water displaced by her motion affected nearby vessels. The smaller liner, New York, moored ahead, strained against her lines. One snapped. The ship swung toward Titanic, pulled by suction. For a brief moment, attention sharpened. Tugs reacted quickly. Titanic's engines were stopped. Lines were secured. The New York was brought under control with only yards to spare. Damage was avoided. The incident caused delay, not alarm. Such occurrences were known risks in crowded harbours. Adjustments were made. Departure resumed. Those who noticed the event saw it as an inconvenience, not a warning. By early afternoon, Titanic moved down the River Test toward open water. Crowds watched from shore. Some waved, some simply observed. The ship's whistle sounded, deep and measured. Once clear of the harbour, Titanic turned south toward the English Channel. The engines settled into steady rhythm. The voyage had begun. Life aboard adjusted smoothly. Lunch was served. Passengers explored decks. Crew resumed routines, now oriented toward movement rather than preparation. The ship's size dampened sensation of motion. For many on board, the sea felt distant, almost irrelevant. That evening, Titanic approached Cherbourg, France. The port was too shallow for the ship to dock directly. Instead, tenders ferried passengers and mail between shore and ship. This process was efficient, but time-consuming. First-class passengers boarded from Cherbourg, some of them among the wealthiest individuals on board. Their arrival added to the social atmosphere of the voyage, but did not alter its tone. Cabins were filled, dining arrangements adjusted. By nightfall, Titanic resumed her westward course. The channel opened into the Atlantic. The ship's speed increased slightly. The sense of transition was subtle. There was no clear moment when Europe felt left behind. The sea simply widened. On April 11, Titanic reached Queenstown, Ireland, her final port of call. Again, tenders handled boarding. This stop added mostly third-class passengers, families and individuals emigrating to North America. Some disembarked as well, completing short journeys. Queenstown marked a psychological boundary. After leaving, Titanic would not see land again until North America. Even so, the atmosphere remained calm. For experienced travellers, this was familiar territory. For emigrants, the crossing ahead was anticipated but not feared. By late afternoon, Titanic turned fully into the open Atlantic. The coast of Ireland receded. The ship settled into her intended cruising speed. Days at sea followed predictable patterns. Weather was fair. The ship moved smoothly. Meals were served on schedule. Wireless messages flowed. Nothing disrupted routine. Passengers adapted quickly. Seasickness was minimal. Activities filled the hours, walking decks, reading, writing letters. Children played quietly. Conversations revolved around destinations rather than dangers. Crew members maintained discipline and pace. Watches rotated. Logs were updated. Equipment functioned as designed. The ship performed exactly as expected. There was no sense of urgency and speed. Titanic was not racing. She was following schedule, not pushing limits. This distinction mattered to those in command. The ship's reputation rested on reliability, not haste. As night fell on the open Atlantic for the first time, lights glowed throughout the ship. From outside, Titanic appeared like a floating city, steady and bright against the dark water. Below decks, engines continued their work. Firemen shoveled coal, engineers monitored pressure. Electricity powered lighting, heating, and communication. The ship felt self-contained, sustained by its own systems. Passengers retired to cabins, adjusted to gentle vibration, and slept. The sea remained calm. The ship's motion was consistent, almost hypnotic. This was how the voyage was meant to feel: predictable, controlled, ordinary. No one on board perceived departure as a threshold crossed into uncertainty. Southampton, Cherbourg, and Queenstown were steps along a planned route, not moments of decision. Each departure reinforced the belief that the next would follow just as smoothly. The Atlantic stretched ahead, wide and cold, but familiar in concept. Charts had mapped it. Ships crossed it daily. Weather reports were exchanged. Experience suggested that nothing lay ahead that could not be handled. Titanic moved westward under that assumption, her passengers and crew settling into patterns that would define the coming days. The ship had left land behind, but not certainty. And so the sailing from Southampton, through ports and into open ocean, completed without drama. The voyage was underway, carried forward by confidence earned over decades of successful crossings. Life at sea, small details. Once Titanic cleared Queenstown and turned fully into the Atlantic, the voyage entered its longest and quietest phase. This was the portion of the crossing that most passengers expected to remember least. Days at sea were not designed to be remarkable. They were meant to pass smoothly, marked by meals, rest, and small diversions, all arranged to make time feel organised and unthreatening. The first full day at sea unfolded without incident. The weather was cool but calm. The sea showed only low swells, barely noticeable given the ship's size. For passengers accustomed to earlier generations of ships, the steadiness was striking. Titanic did not roll sharply or pitch. She moved forward with a slow, confident rhythm that muted awareness of the ocean altogether. Morning routines developed quickly. Stewards moved through corridors at regular intervals, checking cabins, refreshing wash basins, and tidying personal spaces. Their presence was efficient and quiet. Passengers often encountered them only briefly, yet their work shaped the entire atmosphere of the ship. In first class, breakfast was a leisurely affair. Served over extended hours, it allowed passengers to rise when they wished. Some took early walks on the promenade deck before eating. Others remained in cabins, reading or writing letters. The pace was unhurried, shaped by choice rather than necessity. Second-class passengers followed a more structured schedule. Breakfast hours were fixed. Activities clustered around meals. Still, there was little sense of restriction. The ship provided enough space that crowding was rarely felt. Third-class passengers experienced the ship differently. Their days were shaped by communal spaces and shared routines. Meals were served at set times, often lively and noisy. Conversations crossed languages. Children occupied themselves in open areas under informal supervision. Despite fewer comforts, there was a sense of order and relative ease. Across all classes, the ship encouraged walking. Decks stretched long and uninterrupted. Passengers paced them slowly, often retracing the same paths. These walks served no destination. They were habits meant to fill time gently. Inside, public rooms remained busy without becoming loud. The library saw steady use. Writing desks were occupied by those composing letters that would later be mailed when land was reached. These letters often described the ship more than the sea. People commented on comfort, service, and weather, reinforcing the idea that nothing unusual was occurring. Meals structured the day. Lunch followed breakfast, then afternoon tea, then dinner. In first class, dinner was the most formal event. Dress codes were observed. Service was deliberate. Courses followed one another in predictable order. The ritual mattered more than the food itself. It marked time. Below decks, a different rhythm persisted. Engine room crews worked rotating shifts, maintaining pressure and speed. Firemen laboured in near-constant heat, shoveling coal into furnaces that consumed fuel relentlessly. Their work never paused, day or night. They measured progress not in miles but in tons of coal burned. Trimmers moved coal within bunkers, ensuring that supply remained balanced. Their environment was cramped and dark. They worked by lamplight, breathing dust and sweat. Few passengers were aware of their existence. Fewer still understood how essential they were to the ship's motion. In the mail room, clerks sorted letters continuously. Titanic carried one of the largest mail consignments ever loaded onto a ship. Regulations required that mail be handled even at sea. Clerks worked long hours, surrounded by sacks and sorting tables. Their task connected the ship to the world beyond the horizon. The wireless room operated almost constantly. Passenger messages flowed outward. Reports and acknowledgements flowed inward. Wireless operators focused on clearing backlogs rather than monitoring navigational information. Their priority reflected commercial reality. Passengers expected communication. Ice warnings were part of the background, not the foreground. On the bridge, watches rotated routinely. Officers noted weather conditions, speed, and course. Logbooks were updated at regular intervals. Orders were passed calmly. There was no need for heightened alertness. Conditions did not demand it. The ship's speed increased slightly as she settled into the open Atlantic. This was normal. Titanic was designed to cruise efficiently once clear of traffic and ports. There was no sense of pushing limits. The engines ran smoothly, without strain. Passengers noticed the speed only indirectly. The vibration beneath their feet was steady. The wake trailed long and white behind the ship. Time zones shifted gradually, announced through clocks adjusted by the crew. Even time itself felt managed. Children adapted quickly to shipboard life. They explored allowed areas, accompanied by parents or nurses. The ship felt safe. There were rails, wide decks, and constant supervision. Few restrictions felt oppressive. Adults trusted the environment. Social interactions followed familiar patterns. People conversed with those they had met during boarding or meals. Friendships formed casually. Some passengers spent long hours alone, content with books or thought. There was no pressure to participate. Crew members maintained professional distance. Stewards addressed passengers formally. Officers acknowledged greetings but did not linger. The hierarchy remained intact. Not enforced harshly, but observed naturally. At night, the ship transformed quietly. Lights dimmed in public spaces. Corridors softened into silence broken only by footsteps and distant machinery. Passengers retired to cabins, adjusting to gentle vibration and enclosed stillness. The sea outside remained largely unseen. Few passengers ventured out at night. Those who did noticed the cold more than the water. Stars appeared sharp and numerous when clouds cleared. The ship's lights reflected faintly on the surface below. Inside cabins, sounds blended into a steady background engines, ventilation, occasional voices. These sounds became familiar quickly. They reassured rather than disturbed. Silence, when it occurred, felt unusual. The second day at sea passed much like the first. Weather remained fair. Temperatures dropped slightly as the ship moved northward, but this was expected for April. Passengers added coats when going outside. Stewards adjusted heating as needed. There were no formal announcements. Information travelled informally through conversation, through posted notices about meal times or minor schedule adjustments. The absence of news reinforced the sense that nothing required attention. The ship's doctor attended to minor ailments, colds, headaches, occasional seasickness. Nothing out of the ordinary. Medical facilities were adequate and rarely strained. Religious services were planned for Sunday. Notices appeared quietly. Attendance was voluntary. For many, the service marked time more than devotion. It provided structure to the day. By the third day, Titanic felt familiar. Passengers navigated corridors without hesitation. Crew members recognized faces. The ship's vastness no longer overwhelmed. It became background. This familiarity mattered. It reduced awareness of risk. When an environment feels known, it feels safer, even if its fundamental nature has not changed. The ocean remained cold and unforgiving, but it was distant from daily experience. Even small inconveniences were absorbed easily. A delayed message, a crowded corridor, a closed deck, due to weather none suggested danger. They were minor adjustments within a functioning system. Ice warnings began arriving more frequently as the ship progressed westward. They were received, noted, and sometimes passed along, but they did not alter routine significantly. Ice was a known hazard, managed through vigilance and course adjustments. It was not viewed as an emergency. The ship's size contributed to this perception. Titanic felt substantial, solid, unaffected by small changes in sea or weather. Her mass insulated passengers from external conditions. By Sunday, April 14, routines were firmly established. Passengers anticipated another quiet day. Crew members expected nothing beyond standard duty. The voyage was nearing its midpoint. This calm was not ignorance. It was trust. Trust in design, in experience, in precedent. The small details of life at sea, meals, walks, work shifts reinforced that trust continuously. Nothing in these days suggested that routine would soon fail. The ship functioned as designed. People behaved as expected. The system appeared complete. And so, Titanic continued westward, carrying her floating world across open water, sustained by habits so ordinary that they masked the extraordinary vulnerability beneath them. Ice warnings and North Atlantic reality. As Titanic moved farther into the North Atlantic, the ocean resumed its older role, not as scenery, but as an environment with patterns that predated steamships, schedules, and wireless signals. To those who worked the sea for a living, April carried expectations as clear as any calendar entry. Ice was part of the season. It arrived with the currents, drifted southward from Greenland, and scattered itself unpredictably across shipping lanes that had grown increasingly busy. This reality was neither mysterious nor new. Masters and officers had dealt with ice for decades. Charts noted typical boundaries. Seasonal bulletins were circulated. Experience filled in the rest. The North Atlantic in spring demanded attention, not fear. Ice warnings came to Titanic through wireless messages sent by other ships. These messages varied in precision and urgency. Some listed coordinates. Others spoke generally of bergs and field ice. Each report reflected what its sender had observed at a particular moment, in a particular place. Together, they formed a loose map, imperfect, shifting, and incomplete. Wireless communication in 1912 was still a hybrid service. It was essential but not yet fully integrated into navigation. Operators worked primarily to transmit passenger messages and commercial traffic. Ice reports were important, but they did not automatically override other duties. There was no centralized system for prioritizing or consolidating warnings. On Titanic, ice messages were received, logged, and sometimes forwarded to the bridge. The process depended on timing, workload, and judgment. When the wireless room was busy clearing passenger traffic, messages accumulated. When officers were occupied, information waited. This was not negligence. It was the normal operation of a new technology still finding its place aboard ships. Wireless had reduced isolation, but it had not eliminated uncertainty. Officers on the bridge were accustomed to receiving ice reports during spring crossings. They adjusted routes slightly, maintained watchfulness, and trusted their ability to detect hazards visually. Ships had long navigated icy waters without wireless assistance at all. Technology supplemented experience rather than replacing it. Titanic's route followed established lanes designed to minimize risk. These tracks were chosen based on traffic patterns, fuel efficiency, and historical data. Deviating significantly required reason. Ice reports provided context, not commands. As reports accumulated, they suggested that ice extended farther south than usual. This information was noted. It did not immediately change operations. The sea remained calm, visibility was good, temperatures were dropping, but gradually. The ship's speed remained steady. There was no expectation that speed alone created danger. In clear conditions, speed was considered an advantage. It allowed a ship to pass through areas of concern quickly, reducing exposure time. This belief was common at the time. Slowing down unnecessarily carried its own risks, including loss of steerage and schedule disruption. Officers balanced competing considerations using judgment shaped by experience. Throughout Saturday and into Sunday, April 14, ice messages continued to arrive. Some were acknowledged, others were posted in the chart room. The information was there, but it existed within a framework that treated ice as a manageable condition rather than an imminent threat. Temperature readings offered subtle clues. As the ship moved westward, the air cooled more sharply. Seamen noticed this change instinctively. Cold air often accompanied ice. Still, cold air alone did not demand drastic action. It was one data point among many. The sea itself appeared unusually calm. There was little swell, little wind. To passengers, this calm felt pleasant. To experienced officers, it removed one natural warning sign. Waves breaking against ice often revealed its presence. On a flat sea, bergs could be harder to see. This detail mattered, but it was not alarming on its own. Calm seas were common. Officers adjusted lookout practices accordingly, trusting eyes trained by years at sea. Lookouts were posted in the crow's nest as usual. They relied on sight rather than instruments. Binoculars were not standard equipment for lookouts, and their absence was not considered significant. Detection depended on contrast dark shapes against lighter water, or white ice against darker sea. Night navigation was routine. Ships crossed oceans at all hours. Officers and crew were trained to operate in darkness. Titanic's bridge was staffed according to standard practice. What distinguished the night of April 14 was not a single decision, but the convergence of conditions that reduced margins quietly. Ice warnings suggested caution. Calm seas reduced visibility cues. Darkness removed colour contrast. Cold air hinted at proximity to ice fields. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, they narrowed options. Passengers, of course, were largely unaware of this context. The ship's interior remained warm and bright. Dinner proceeded on schedule. Conversations flowed easily. The sea's reality stayed outside, beyond windows and awareness. The wireless room continued to operate heavily. Passenger messages increased as the voyage progressed. People sent notes ahead, informing contacts of arrival plans. The ship's success reinforced demand for communication. Some ice messages arrived during this period that did not reach the bridge promptly. They were not ignored, but delayed by workload and procedure. In the absence of a defined emergency protocol, delay did not feel dangerous. This illustrates a broader truth about systems. They function according to priorities that make sense in ordinary conditions. When conditions shift, those priorities may lag behind reality. Captain Smith was aware of ice reports. He discussed them with officers. The ship's course was adjusted slightly southward earlier in the voyage, reflecting standard response. No one believed Titanic was steering blindly into danger. The bridge did not operate in isolation. It relied on reports, instruments, and human senses. Each had limitations. Navigation was an exercise in managing uncertainty, not eliminating it. Maritime culture placed strong emphasis on experience. Officers trusted judgment earned through repetition. They had seen ice before. They had avoided it before. There was no reason to assume this time would be different. The North Atlantic itself offered no warning signs that night beyond cold and calm. The horizon lay dark and indistinct. Stars shone clearly. The sea appeared smooth. Such conditions were not rare. They did not trigger alarm bells. Instead, they demanded attention and care, which officers believed they were providing. Titanic's size again influenced perception. Large ships felt stable, resistant to sudden change. Officers believed that even if ice were encountered, damage would likely be limited. This belief rested on past incidents where ships struck ice and survived. What was not fully understood was how a glancing blow across multiple compartments could defeat compartmentalization. This scenario lay outside common experience. As Sunday evening progressed, ice reports became more numerous. The information was there, but it existed as background rather than foreground. No single report stood out as decisive. This diffusion of responsibility mattered. When warnings arrive incrementally, they can blend into routine. Urgency dissipates across time. The wireless system amplified information without organizing it. Messages came from different ships at different times. There was no central authority synthesizing data into a clear directive. This was not a failure of individuals. It was a limitation of the system as it existed. By late evening, Titanic approached the region where ice had been reported. Officers were aware. Lookouts were attentive. The ship continued at speed considered appropriate for conditions. There was no sense of racing or recklessness. There was confidence grounded in familiarity. In hindsight, the accumulation of small risk factors appears obvious. At the time, it felt ordinary. This difference between retrospective clarity and lived experience defines much of what followed. The North Atlantic did not announce danger. It simply waited, unchanged by human schedules or confidence. As the ship moved steadily westward under a clear, cold sky, the conditions that had developed quietly over days came into alignment. The ocean offered no drama, only reality. And within that reality, Titanic continued on her course, guided by experience that had not yet learned what it would soon confront. Sunday, April 14. A quiet confidence. Sunday aboard Titanic began without distinction. It arrived not as a turning point, but as another carefully arranged day at sea, shaped by habit and expectation. The ship had been underway long enough for routines to feel established, yet not long enough for monotony to take hold. For most on board, Sunday carried a familiar rhythm, softened by the isolation of the ocean and the steady reliability of the ship. Morning brought cool air and clear skies. The temperature had dropped further overnight, noticeable but not uncomfortable. Passengers added coats before stepping onto open decks. The sea remained calm, almost flat, its surface broken only by the ship's passage. There was no wind to speak of. Smoke from the funnels rose straight into the sky before thinning out. Breakfast followed schedule. In first class, passengers arrived at leisure, some after morning walks, others after lingering in bed. Conversation was easy and unhurried. Topics centered on travel plans, acquaintances made aboard, and impressions of the ship. There was quiet satisfaction in being part of a well-run enterprise. Second-class passengers followed similar patterns with less ceremony. Meals were prompt, service efficient. The ship's size and steadiness continued to impress. For many, this was the smoothest crossing they had experienced. In third class, the day began earlier. Families rose together. Children moved between bunks and shared spaces. Meals were lively. There was noise, but also order. Crew members supervised without tension. The crossing so far had exceeded expectations formed by stories of older emigrant ships. Religious services marked the day gently. In first and second class, services were held in designated rooms, attended by those who wished to observe the day formally. Hymns were sung, prayers offered. The tone was reflective but calm. There was no mention of danger or difficulty. The sea outside remained absent from thought. For others, Sunday simply meant a change in routine. Some chose to write letters, others spent time reading. The library and lounges saw steady use. The ship's interior spaces absorbed people easily, spreading them out so that crowding rarely occurred. On deck, passengers continued their walks. The cold air sharpened awareness but did not deter movement. People commented on the clarity of the sky and the calmness of the sea. The ocean appeared orderly, subdued. Crew members followed Sunday routines as well. Watches rotated as usual. Maintenance tasks continued. Engineers monitored machinery. Firemen laboured below decks without pause. Their work was constant, unaffected by the day of the week. The wireless room remained busy. Passenger traffic increased as the ship progressed westward. Messages were sent ahead to announce arrival plans. Replies arrived from shore. The ship felt connected, not isolated. Ice messages continued to come in. They were received, logged, and shared as time allowed. Officers were aware that ice lay ahead. Course and speed remained unchanged. This was not an oversight. It reflected judgment shaped by experience and prevailing practice. Captain Smith spent part of the day on the bridge and part circulating among passengers. His presence was reassuring. He spoke casually with travellers, projecting calm. There was no reason to behave otherwise. The ship's course had already been adjusted slightly earlier in response to ice reports. This adjustment was viewed as sufficient. The North Atlantic was wide. Avoidance did not require radical deviation. By afternoon, the temperature dropped further. Passengers noticed their breath faintly in the air. Crew members adjusted heating. Doors to open decks were sometimes closed briefly, then reopened. These were minor adjustments, not warnings. Lunch passed without comment. Afternoon tea followed. The steady progression of meals continued to define time. Each course, each serving, reinforced the sense that everything was proceeding as planned. As daylight faded, the ship prepared for evening. Lights brightened inside. The contrast between interior warmth and exterior cold increased. Few passengers lingered on deck after sunset. The sea outside became an abstract presence. Dinner on Sunday evening was unremarkable in content but significant in retrospect. In first class, it was a social occasion. Attire followed expectations. Service was smooth. Conversations touched on weather, plans in New York, and the novelty of the ship. No one discussed ice with urgency. Second-class dinner followed similar patterns, though simpler. Third-class passengers ate earlier, then returned to communal areas or cabins. Children were settled for the night. Families prepared for another day at sea. Behind the scenes, the ship continued forward at steady speed. Engines worked efficiently. The helm maintained course. Lookouts took their positions as night fell. The night itself was unusually clear. Stars appeared sharp and numerous. The moon was absent, leaving the sea dark. The calm water reflected little light. The horizon was indistinct. On the bridge, officers took note of conditions. Calm seas and cold air were observed. These details were not ignored. They were noted and integrated into existing expectations. There was no protocol demanding drastic action in such conditions. The lookouts stood watch in the crow's nest, scanning ahead. Their task was routine. They relied on sight and experience. There was no radar, no electronic detection. The human eye remained the primary instrument. Passengers retired gradually. Cabins filled with the familiar sounds of shipboard night. Distant engines, muffled footsteps, occasional voices. The ship's interior retained its warmth and light. Some passengers remained awake longer than usual. Social gatherings extended into the evening. Card games, conversations, and reading occupied time. There was no sense of urgency to sleep. Crew members maintained vigilance. Watches changed, reports were passed, logs were updated. Everything followed established procedure. Ice reports continued to arrive in the wireless room. One message, reporting heavy ice directly ahead, came in during the evening. It was logged and set aside to be delivered to the bridge when practical. The wireless operators were occupied clearing passenger traffic. The message did not interrupt their workflow. This moment illustrates how systems prioritize according to design. Passenger communication was the wireless service's primary function. Navigational information, though important, did not always override that priority. On the bridge, officers relied on their own observations and previously received reports. They knew ice lay ahead. They expected to encounter it. They believed they would see it in time to avoid it. Speed remained steady. This choice reflected confidence in visibility and maneuverability. Slowing down was an option, but not an automatic one. The absence of visible danger supported continuation. The ship's design reinforced this confidence. Titanic was expected to handle minor impacts without serious consequence. The concept of unsinkability, though often overstated later, contributed to a sense that worst-case scenarios were unlikely. As the night deepened, the temperature continued to fall. The air grew sharper. Crew members noticed frost forming in places. These were signs of proximity to ice, but not definitive indicators of immediate danger. The sea remained smooth. There were no waves breaking against unseen obstacles. This absence removed a natural warning sign. The ocean offered no noise, no disturbance. Passengers slept. For most, the night passed unnoticed until it ended abruptly. At this stage, there was no anticipation of that end. Sunday, April 14, closed as it had opened with calm, routine and confidence. Nothing in the ship's interior suggested imminent change. The systems that governed life aboard Titanic continued to function smoothly. In retrospect, this day stands out not because of what happened, but because of what did not. There were no alarms, no confrontations, no visible failures. The ship moved forward under assumptions that had held true many times before. The quiet confidence of that Sunday night was not carelessness. It was the product of experience, technology, and culture aligned towards stability. That alignment would soon be tested in ways no one aboard fully anticipated. As Titanic pressed westward under a clear, star-filled sky, the day ended without remark. The voyage continued, guided by habits that had not yet met their limits. The moment of impact. Late on the night of April 14, Titanic moved through the North Atlantic with a steadiness that felt unchanged from the hours before. From within the ship, nothing suggested a turning point. The engines maintained their rhythm. The decks were quiet. Most passengers slept, unaware that the conditions outside darkness, calm water, falling temperature, had narrowed the margin between routine and consequence. On the bridge, the watch followed established procedure. Officers monitored the ship's course and speed, exchanging brief updates as duties rotated. There was no tension in their movements. This was a familiar hour, one they had lived through many times on other crossings. Experience guided posture and pace. High above the bridge, in the crow's nest, the lookouts stood watch. Their task was straightforward in description and difficult in execution. Scan the darkness ahead for anything that did not belong. On a night with waves or moonlight, ice often revealed itself through contrast or sound. On this night, the sea lay flat and black, offering no such help. The lookout's eyes adjusted continually. They searched for the faintest outline, the slightest change in texture where sea met sky. Cold air sharpened focus but also numbed sensation. There was no wind to carry sound. The world ahead of the ship appeared empty. At approximately 11:40 p.m., that emptiness changed. What was seen first was not a towering shape, but a subtle interruption, a darker mass where none should have been. The iceberg did not gleam white in the darkness. It appeared as a shadow, its edges difficult to define against the black sea and star-filled sky. The sighting allowed little time. Titanic was moving quickly, and her turning circle was large. When the warning reached the bridge, the response was immediate, not panicked. Orders were given in rapid sequence. The helm was put hard over, engines reversed. This response reflected training. Turning away from danger was instinctive. Slowing or stopping alone would not suffice at such speed. The ship needed to change direction. Titanic began to turn. Her bow responded, but not instantly. The mass of the ship resisted sudden change. Momentum carried her forward even as the rudder worked against it. From the bridge, officers watched the dark shape slide closer along the starboard side. There was no dramatic collision, no shuddering crash. Instead, there was a sensation so slight that many passengers did not register it at all. Those awake felt a gentle vibration, a brief scraping sensation, or nothing more than a change in the ship's motion. In some cabins, objects shifted slightly. In others, there was no perceptible effect. Below the waterline, the iceberg did its work quietly. It did not punch a hole. It scraped along the hull, opening seams between steel plates. The damage extended across multiple compartments, each breach small in isolation, together decisive. The iceberg passed into darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Titanic completed her turn and resumed forward motion, now clear of immediate danger. On the bridge, the ship was brought to a stop. Officers assessed what they knew. There was no visible damage above water. The ship remained upright. Engines responded normally. There was no flooding reported immediately. This absence of dramatic signs mattered. It shaped initial interpretation. Ships had struck ice before and survived. A glancing blow suggested limited damage. The design of Titanic reinforced this assumption. Captain Smith arrived on the bridge within moments. Reports were brief and factual. The ship had struck ice. Engines were stopped. The ship appeared intact. Below decks, the reality emerged more slowly. In the forward compartments, crew members heard water rushing where none should be. Engineers and firemen felt cold water entering spaces that had been dry moments before. They reported flooding upward through established channels. Watertight doors were closed remotely from the bridge, sealing compartments as designed. This action worked exactly as intended. Doors dropped, isolating sections of the hull. The system functioned. The problem lay not in failure, but in scale. Too many compartments were compromised. Water spilled from one to the next as the ship's trim changed subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Thomas Andrews was summoned to assess the situation. He moved through the ship methodically, checking reports, inspecting damage, calculating outcomes. His conclusions formed not from alarm but from arithmetic. As he progressed, it became clear that the flooding exceeded the ship's capacity to remain afloat. The bulkheads did not extend high enough. As water rose in forward compartments, it would eventually spill over into adjacent ones. This process would take time. Titanic was not in immediate danger of capsizing or sinking quickly. She was stable, upright, and still. This stability masked the seriousness of the situation. On the bridge, Andrews communicated his findings to Captain Smith. The assessment was direct. The ship would sink. There was no speculation, no dramatization. It was a conclusion based on design limits. The word sink carried weight, but not panic. There was time. Estimates suggested an hour or more before the situation became critical. The ship's slow response created an illusion of control. Initial orders focused on preparation rather than evacuation. Crew members were instructed to uncover lifeboats, assemble passengers, and ready equipment. These actions followed protocol. They did not yet imply urgency to those involved. Passengers became aware of disruption gradually. Some felt the ship stop and wondered why. Others noticed crew members moving with purpose. A few encountered ice fragments on deck, fallen from the hull during impact. These pieces drew curiosity more than fear. Announcements were not made. Officers and stewards relied on direct instruction, believing calm movement preferable to alarming the entire ship. This approach reflected standard practice. In first class, passengers asked questions and received reassuring answers. In second and third class, information spread unevenly. Some remained unaware of any problem. Others sensed that something had changed, but not its significance. The ship's lighting remained on. Heat continued to circulate. The engines were silent now, but electrical systems functioned. The absence of darkness and noise reinforced calm. Crew members began waking passengers and asking them to dress warmly. Life jackets were brought out, though not immediately donned by all. The request to put on a life belt felt precautionary rather than urgent. This was the moment when the gap between reality and perception widened. The ship was fatally damaged, but it did not feel so. There was no fire, no list, no visible flooding in passenger spaces. The impact itself had been modest. Many would later struggle to believe that such a gentle encounter could have such consequences. At the time, that disbelief guided behaviour. On the bridge, preparations continued. Lifeboat crews were assigned, flares were made ready, wireless operators were instructed to send distress signals. The decision to call for help acknowledged seriousness, but it remained procedural. Distress calls had been sent before by ships that did not sink. The expectation was assistance, not abandonment. As the first rockets were prepared, the ship remained steady. The night was quiet. The sea was calm. The moment of impact, in retrospect, defined everything that followed, but at the time, it did not feel like a climax. It felt like an interruption, an unexpected event that required attention but not yet fear. The iceberg was already gone, indifferent and silent. Titanic, though wounded beyond recovery, still appeared whole. This contrast between cause and effect, between a brief contact and a prolonged outcome, shaped the human response. People react to what they perceive, not to what calculations predict. In those first minutes after impact, perception suggested manageability. The systems had responded. The ship stood firm. There was time. That belief, formed in the quiet aftermath of a barely felt collision, would influence every decision made in the hours that followed. Realizing the ship will sink. After the impact, Titanic entered a period that felt suspended in time. The ship lay still in the water, engines silent, lights glowing steadily throughout her vast interior. To anyone moving through passenger spaces, the situation did not yet resemble an emergency. It felt more like a pause, an unscheduled stop that required explanation rather than alarm. Captain Smith remained on the bridge, receiving reports as they arrived. Information came in fragments. Crew members from below decks described flooding in forward compartments. Engineers confirmed rising water levels. Each report added weight, but none arrived with drama. They were delivered calmly, in the language of professionals describing conditions they could see and measure. Thomas Andrews continued his inspection. He moved downward through the ship, accompanied by crew members who opened doors and pointed out damage. His method was systematic. He counted compartments affected, noted the rate of water ingress, and observed the ship's trim. These details mattered more than impressions. Water was entering at least 5 forward compartments. Individually, none of these breaches would have been fatal. Together, they exceeded Titanic's design limits. The bulkheads, strong and well built, did not extend high enough to contain flooding across that many sections once the bow settled lower. The ship's response was slow and deceptively gentle. As water accumulated forward, the bow dipped slightly. This change was measured in inches, not degrees. There was no sensation of tipping or instability. To most aboard, the ship still felt level. This subtlety shaped human response. People expect emergencies to announce themselves. When they do not, urgency is difficult to sustain. Andrews returned to the bridge to report his findings. His conclusion was straightforward and final. Titanic would sink. The time estimate was limited, perhaps an hour, maybe a little more. The ship could not remain afloat indefinitely. Captain Smith absorbed this information quietly. There was no visible reaction beyond acknowledgement. The next steps were practical. Orders were given to prepare lifeboats fully and to begin calling passengers on deck. Wireless operators were instructed to send distress signals. They began transmitting the call for help, initially using the older CQD signal, later adding the newer SOS. Nearby ships responded, some closer than others. Distances were calculated. Assistance was on the way, but not immediate. These actions marked a shift from preparation to acknowledgement. The ship was in serious trouble. Yet even now, the situation did not feel catastrophic to those outside the bridge and lower decks. Stewards were tasked with waking passengers and instructing them to dress warmly and put on life jackets. The phrasing mattered. They did not say the ship was sinking. They said it was precautionary, that there was no danger. This was not deception born of indifference. It was a belief that calm compliance required reassurance. Panic, officers believed, would make evacuation harder, not easier. Passengers responded accordingly. Some complied immediately, dressing and heading to decks. Others hesitated, reluctant to leave warm cabins for cold night air without clear explanation. A few laughed off the suggestion, seeing life jackets as unnecessary. In first class, questions were asked politely and answered vaguely. The tone remained controlled. Stewards and officers believed they were maintaining order by minimizing information. This approach reflected maritime tradition and social expectations. In second and third class, information spread unevenly. Language barriers complicated instruction. Some passengers followed crew directions readily. Others waited, uncertain whether to act. As people gathered on deck, the environment felt strange rather than frightening. The night was cold and clear. Stars shone brightly. The sea lay calm and black. The ship's lights cast a warm glow over faces and railings. Lifeboats were uncovered and swung out. Crew members worked deliberately, checking lines and equipment. This activity drew attention, but not necessarily alarm. Many passengers assumed it was a drill or precaution. The number of lifeboats available was visible. Some noticed that not everyone could fit. Others did not calculate capacity. The idea that a modern ship would require complete abandonment felt remote. Captain Smith moved between bridge and deck, overseeing preparations. He issued orders quietly, relying on officers to carry them out. His authority remained intact. There was no chaos, no shouting. Officers assigned to lifeboats took charge of their stations. They organized crew, prepared davits, and instructed stewards. Each officer interpreted orders slightly differently, based on personal understanding and temperament. One instruction, women and children first, carried ambiguity. Did it mean only women and children? Or priority for them? Different officers answered differently, and this difference would shape outcomes. As the first boats were loaded, hesitation slowed the process. Passengers were reluctant to enter small boats suspended over dark water when the large ship beneath them appeared stable. Some refused outright. Others stepped back to wait. This reluctance frustrated crew members, who struggled to persuade people that leaving the ship was safer than remaining aboard. Without visible danger, the argument lacked force. Boats began to lower, partially filled. Officers made decisions in the moment, balancing speed against capacity. Waiting for boats to fill risked delay. Lowering them half-empty felt wasteful but expedient. The ship continued to sink slowly. Water advanced forward, compartment by compartment. The bow dipped further, though still subtly. The list remained minimal. The deck angle was not yet obvious to most. Below decks, conditions worsened. Flooded spaces forced crew members to retreat upward. Pumps ran continuously but could not keep pace. Engineers remained at their posts as long as possible, maintaining power and lighting. Their presence ensured that the ship remained illuminated and warm longer than expected. This extended calm, but also delayed awareness of seriousness. Wireless operators continued transmitting distress calls. Responses came in. The nearest ship capable of assistance was Carpathia, several hours away. Other ships were closer but did not respond effectively due to distance, misunderstanding, or inattention. This gap between call and rescue widened the stakes. The ship could not remain afloat long enough to await immediate help. Lifeboats became essential rather than supplementary. As time passed, the deck angle increased slightly. People began to notice that walking felt different. Objects no longer sat flat. This physical cue did more to communicate danger than any announcement. Crew members urged passengers more firmly now. Life jackets were insisted upon. More boats were launched. Still, the process remained uneven. Some passengers resisted separation from family members. In mixed groups, instructions to prioritize women and children created confusion and distress. Officers enforced rules as they understood them, sometimes strictly, sometimes flexibly. Third-class passengers reached the boat deck later, delayed by distance, barriers, and lack of information. When they arrived, many boats were already gone. The reality of limited capacity became unavoidable. The ship's bow dipped lower into the sea. Water reached the well deck forward. This sight altered perception decisively. What had felt like precaution now looked like necessity. As water advanced, the ship's trim increased. The forward decks were no longer usable. Lifeboat operations shifted aft. Time grew short. Throughout this period, the absence of dramatic noise or motion remained striking. The ship did not groan or shudder. It settled steadily, almost patiently, into the water. This steadiness worked against urgency. Humans are attuned to sudden change. Gradual change invites adjustment rather than alarm. Captain Smith faced decisions without precedent. He had never abandoned a ship before. No captain of a liner this size had. He relied on training that assumed assistance would arrive or damage would be contained. As lifeboats departed, the number remaining dwindled. Officers recognized that not everyone could be saved this way. The realization spread quietly, without announcement. Passengers who remained on board began to sense the narrowing of options. Some accepted it calmly, others searched for alternatives. There was no single response. The ship's designers had not envisioned this scenario. Neither had regulators. The gap between design assumptions and reality now became fatal. As midnight passed, Titanic crossed from manageable emergency into irreversible loss. The calculations had been correct. The water continued to rise. Realization came not as a sudden shock, but as a slow accumulation of evidence. Each boat launched, each foot of deck submerged. Each failed pump confirmed what Andrews had concluded earlier. The ship would sink. The only question left was how many would leave her before she did. Boats, orders, and human hesitation. As the reality of Titanic's conditions settled in, the work on deck took on a different character. What had begun as preparation now became execution under constraint. The ship was still upright enough to allow movement, but the margin for delay narrowed with each passing minute. The cold sharpened, the night deepened, and the lifeboats, few, exposed, and unforgiving, became the only means of escape. Officers took charge of individual boats, each bringing personal interpretation to the same broad instruction. Women and children first sounded clear in principle, Yet it left unanswered questions in practice. Did it mean women and children only, or women and children with priority? Did it apply uniformly, or could exceptions be made? The absence of a single explicit directive allowed discretion to fill the gap. Second Officer Lightoller enforced the rules strictly on the port side. He allowed no men into boats while women and children remained nearby, even if seats were empty. His approach reflected a rigid understanding of order and duty. Boats under his control were lowered with unused capacity rather than delay. First Officer Murdoch, working the starboard side, interpreted the instruction differently. He prioritized women and children, but allowed men to board if no women or children were immediately available. His approach aimed to maximize occupancy and speed. These differences were not the result of confusion or insubordination. They reflected professional judgment shaped by personality and training. In a system without detailed contingency plans, judgment filled the space. Crew members assigned to boats worked under pressure. Ropes had to be secured correctly. Davits had to be operated smoothly. A mistake could capsize a boat or jam equipment. Every action required care, even as time pressed. Passengers reacted in varied ways. Some stepped forward readily, accepting instructions without question. Others hesitated, reluctant to leave the apparent safety of the ship for the unknown of open water. The size of Titanic distorted perception. The lifeboats looked small, fragile, and exposed by comparison. The height of the drop intensified fear. Boats were lowered from decks far above the waterline. Looking down into darkness, with only starlight and distant reflections, required resolve. For many, the act felt more dangerous than remaining aboard. Women with children faced decisions under stress. Some refused to leave husbands behind. Others insisted on boarding together. Officers intervened unevenly, sometimes enforcing separation, sometimes yielding to pleas. There was no consistent policy beyond the broad rule. Third-class passengers encountered additional obstacles. The distance from their quarters to the boat deck was significant. Some routes were unfamiliar. Language barriers complicated instruction. In some cases, physical barriers delayed movement until they were opened by crew. When third-class passengers reached the deck, they often found boats already gone or nearly full. Confusion followed. Instructions were shouted, translated, repeated. The cold and darkness made coordination difficult. Despite these challenges, there was no widespread panic. Movement remained largely orderly. Voices rose occasionally, but crowds did not surge. This restraint reflected both discipline and disbelief. The situation still felt unreal to many. Boats continued to be launched at intervals. Some left half empty. Others were filled close to capacity. The inconsistency troubled observers but reflected the conditions under which decisions were made. Speed, safety, and compliance competed for priority. As more boats departed, the deck grew emptier. Those remaining became more aware of numbers. The calculation was unavoidable now. There were not enough places. Crew members attempted to improvise solutions. Collapsible boats were prepared, though their unfamiliar design caused delays. Some were lashed to roofs or prepared for later release. These actions reflected desperation tempered by training. The ship's angle increased gradually. The forward deck sloped perceptibly. Water crept closer to passenger spaces. The cold intensified as the bow settled deeper. With each change, urgency sharpened. Passengers who had delayed now pressed forward. Officers enforced rules more firmly. The atmosphere shifted from calm compliance to constrained haste. Some passengers sought alternative survival strategies. They gathered on upper decks, hoping for rescue or a last-minute solution. Others searched for flotation, though such items were scarce. The band played on nearby, providing a steady background that softened edges without distracting attention. The music did not signal denial. It reinforced routine, offering familiarity in an unfamiliar moment. Wireless operators continued transmitting as long as power allowed. Signals went out into the dark, unanswered immediately. The knowledge that help was coming, but not soon enough, weighed heavily. Below decks, water advanced relentlessly. Compartments filled and overflowed. Stairways became impassable. Crew members retreated upward, closing doors behind them. The ship's internal geography changed, narrowing options. As the list increased, launching boats became more difficult. Davits were designed for level operation. Angles complicated lowering. Timing became critical. Officers recognized that only a few boats remained. Decisions now affected survival directly. There was no longer time to persuade reluctant passengers extensively. Commands became firmer. Some men attempted to board boats disguised or by force. They were stopped in most cases. Order was maintained, sometimes through physical restraint, more often through authority. Children were lifted into boats. Women followed. Faces reflected shock more than fear. Many believed they would be transferred to another ship shortly. Few grasped the full implications. As boats pulled away, occupants looked back at the illuminated ship. She still appeared whole, her lights bright against the dark sea. This image contradicted the necessity of abandonment. The gap between perception and reality widened further. Those in boats struggled to understand why they had been sent away. Those on deck struggled to accept that staying meant peril. The cold air numbed hands and faces. Breath fogged in the dark. The sea remained calm, indifferent. Crew members who had launched boats now faced a different reality. With fewer passengers to manage, they turned to assisting remaining efforts or preparing for the ship's final stages. Some sought their own survival. Others remained at posts, committed to duty. Captain Smith continued to oversee operations, moving between areas, offering direction where possible. His role narrowed as options disappeared. Authority could not create lifeboats where none existed. The last standard lifeboats were launched. Attention turned to collapsibles. These required special handling. One was lowered successfully. Another was washed from its position later, adding to chaos. As time ran out, the deck angle increased more noticeably. Walking required effort. Railings felt higher on one side, lower on the other. The ship's movement became harder to ignore. Passengers remaining on board gathered toward the stern, the highest remaining point. The forward sections were now close to water level. The ship's immense length emphasized the scale of change. The final moments of organized evacuation approached. There were no speeches, no announcements. People acted individually or in small groups, guided by instinct and observation. Hesitation persisted to the end. Some waited, hoping for instruction that would change reality. Others accepted the inevitable and sought the best available option, however limited. The boats pulled farther away, creating distance between survivors and the ship. That distance brought safety but also isolation. The cold water lay between them and the lights they had left behind. On deck the numbers dwindled. Those who remained now understood, if not fully then enough. The ship would not save them. The system that had governed Titanic so effectively in routine conditions now reached its limit. Orders could not overcome physics. Discipline could not create capacity. The evacuation phase closed not with a clear end, but with exhaustion. The boats were gone. The deck was slanted. The water was close. What remained was the ship itself and those still aboard, facing a future measured in minutes. Wireless calls and distant responses. As lifeboats pulled away from Titanic and the ship's situation grew increasingly irreversible, another struggle continued in parallel, one that unfolded not on deck or below the waterline, but through invisible waves of electrical signals sent out into the night. The wireless room, small and crowded with equipment, became a critical point of connection between the stricken ship and a world that remained frustratingly far away. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the Marconi wireless operators aboard Titanic, had already been working long hours before the collision. Passenger messages had kept the transmitter busy throughout the day and evening. Wireless work was demanding. requiring concentration, repetition, and physical endurance. Messages were sent in Morse code, each letter keyed by hand, each transmission subject to interference and fading. When the order came to send a distress signal, it did not arrive with ceremony. It was practical, direct, and urgent in its own way, but it followed established protocol. Phillips began transmitting CQD, the long-standing distress call recognized by ships equipped with wireless sets. Shortly afterward, he added the newer SOS signal, not yet universally adopted but increasingly understood. The messages went out repeatedly, sent into a darkness that concealed both distance and possibility. Titanic's wireless had considerable power for its time, capable of reaching ships hundreds of miles away under favourable conditions. Responses began to come in, confirming that the call had been heard. One of the first replies came from the RMS Carpathia, operated by the Cunard Line. She was approximately 58 miles away, too far to arrive quickly but close enough to offer hope. Her wireless operator acknowledged Titanic's distress and relayed the message to Captain Arthur Rostron, who responded immediately. Carpathia altered course and began making full speed toward Titanic's reported position. Boilers were pushed beyond normal limits. Heat and hot water were diverted to engines. Known essential services were shut down. The ship drove through ice fields in darkness, guided by wireless updates and lookouts stationed carefully. Rostron's response was decisive and urgent, but even at maximum speed, time remained an unyielding obstacle. Other ships responded as well, though their reactions varied. Some were too far away to assist meaningfully. Others misinterpreted messages or lacked precise information. Wireless technology allowed contact, but it did not guarantee coordination. One ship, the Californian, lay relatively close, possibly within 10 to 20 miles. However, her wireless operator had gone off duty for the night, and the ship did not receive Titanic's distress calls in time. The Californian's crew observed rockets in the distance, but did not interpret them as distress signals. This gap between observation and understanding would later become a focal point of investigation and controversy. The wireless room aboard Titanic grew increasingly crowded as officers and messengers arrived with updates and questions. Phillips and Bride worked continuously, transmitting position updates, acknowledging replies, and attempting to keep channels open. The equipment was not designed for prolonged emergency use. Heat built up, fatigue accumulated. As power began to falter elsewhere in the ship, the wireless remained operational longer than many expected. Engineers maintained electrical systems as long as possible, prioritizing lighting and communication. This decision extended the period during which distress calls could be sent, increasing the chances of rescue for those already in lifeboats. Yet the fundamental limitation remained unchanged. No ship could reach Titanic before she sank. Wireless could summon help, but it could not accelerate ships beyond physical limits. Passengers were largely unaware of the details of this invisible effort. Some heard that help was coming, others did not. The knowledge, where it existed, often brought reassurance rather than urgency. If help was on the way, then the situation felt temporary, manageable. This perception influenced behaviour. Some passengers delayed boarding boats, believing transfer to another ship would occur directly. Others hesitated to leave family members behind, assuming reunion would follow shortly. The delay between call and response stretched perception thin. Minutes passed. Boats departed. The ship settled lower. Yet the idea of imminent rescue persisted, sustained by the simple fact that signals had been sent and received. For the wireless operators, time compressed differently. They worked under constant pressure, aware that their role might directly influence survival outcomes. There was no room for reflection, only transmission. Messages were repeated to ensure clarity. Coordinates were sent again and again. As water advanced through the ship, orders came to prepare to abandon the wireless room. Phillips resisted at first, continuing to send calls until power began to fail and water encroached nearby. Bride assisted him, even after suffering injury during the chaos that followed. The wireless room fell silent before the ship did. Its work ended not because help had arrived, but because Titanic's capacity to speak to the world had reached its limit. Beyond the ship, responses continued to unfold. Carpathia pressed on through ice, guided by reports and intuition. Her crew prepared for survivors. Blankets gathered, medical stations arranged, hot drinks readied. They did not know what they would find. They only knew they were too late to save the ship itself. Other ships adjusted course, but distance made their efforts symbolic rather than effective. The North Atlantic remained wide. Wireless had reduced isolation, but not enough to overcome geography. The rockets fired from Titanic were seen by some vessels, misunderstood by others. Visual signals depended on interpretation. White flares were often used as celebration or communication. Distress rockets were supposed to be red. The ambiguity mattered. This misinterpretation was not ignorance. It reflected inconsistency in standards and training. The maritime world had not yet standardized distress signaling in a way that eliminated doubt. As Titanic's lights remained visible, the illusion of time persisted. Those watching from afar could not easily imagine that such a large, illuminated ship was dying. The scale distorted urgency. Investigations later would examine every message sent and received, every decision made or not made. Timelines would be reconstructed, responsibility debated. But in the moment, events moved according to imperfect systems operated by fallible humans under unprecedented conditions. Wireless communication, for all its promise, revealed its limitations. It extended awareness but not capability. It connected ships but did not coordinate them fully. It created hope but could not fulfill it in time. As the last signals faded and the ship's voice fell silent, the North Atlantic resumed its vast quiet. The calls had gone out, the answers were coming, but the distance between call and rescue remained fixed. The lifeboats drifted nearby, occupants listening to the fading sounds of the ship and watching her lights. They knew help was on the way. They did not yet know what that help would arrive to find. The wireless had done all it could. The rest would depend on time, temperature, and endurance. The ship tilts, time runs out. As the last wireless messages faded and the work of the lifeboats neared its end, Titanic entered a phase where physical change replaced procedure. Up to this point, decisions and actions had dominated events, orders given, boats launched, signals sent. Now, the ship itself began to dictate what was possible. Gravity, water, and time took control, and human influence narrowed with each minute. The most noticeable change was the angle of the deck. What had begun as a barely perceptible dip at the bow grew into a measurable slope. Walking forward required effort. Walking aft felt easier, almost assisted. Objects that had sat undisturbed now slid slowly across floors. Chairs shifted. Doors swung open or shut, depending on their orientation. These were quiet signals, but they were unmistakable. Passengers remaining aboard became acutely aware of these changes. The ship no longer felt neutral beneath their feet. Balance required attention. Handrails were used more frequently. People adjusted posture without conscious thought, responding to the altered geometry of the deck. Water advanced steadily, no longer hidden below. It reached the forward well deck and spilled over its edge. This sight water, where there had been open space, communicated urgency more clearly than any instruction could. It marked a transition from abstraction to reality. Crew members redirected remaining passengers toward the stern, the highest remaining point. This movement was not orderly in the sense of lines or formations. It was guided by observation and instinct. People moved where the ship allowed them to move. The grand spaces that had defined Titanic's luxury changed character rapidly. Staircases that had once served as symbols of elegance became channels for retreat. Corridors lost their symmetry as the angle distorted perspective. The ship's interior, designed for stability, now revealed its vulnerability to asymmetry. Lighting remained on, though it flickered occasionally as power demands shifted. The continued illumination preserved a sense of normalcy that no longer matched conditions. Faces were clearly visible. Expressions reflected confusion, resignation, and focus rather than panic. Below decks, conditions had deteriorated beyond use. Compartments were flooded fully. Stairways were blocked. The ship's internal boundaries, once orderly, now forced movement upward and aft. Crew members who had worked below retreated to upper levels, their duties complete. The engine rooms, still manned until recently, fell silent. Boilers were drowned. Machinery that had powered the ship across the ocean ceased operation. The absence of engine noise marked a significant shift. The ship was no longer travelling. It was settling. As the bow sank deeper, pressure increased on the ship's structure. The hull, designed to distribute stress evenly, now bore uneven loads. The stern rose gradually, lifting screws clear of the water. This change altered the ship's silhouette against the night sky. Passengers gathered near the stern railings, drawn there by the simple logic of elevation. The water was farther away. The deck felt less steep. There was room to stand. From this vantage point, the ship appeared divided. Forward, darkness and water dominated. Aft, light and relative dryness persisted. The contrast was stark and unsettling. Lifeboats that remained nearby drifted farther away, either by intention or current. Occupants watched silently. The distance grew, both physical and psychological. Those in boats felt the separation keenly, aware that return was no longer possible. The band continued playing for a time, its presence reinforcing routine in a moment when routine had lost relevance. The music did not deny reality. It softened its edges, offering familiarity amid disintegration. As the angle increased, moving became more difficult. Walking required leaning forward. Standing still required bracing. People adapted, but the effort drained energy. Water reached the base of the grand staircase. The site carried symbolic weight, though no one spoke of it. The staircase had represented order and luxury. Now it marked the boundary between what had been and what could no longer be used. The ship's trim continued to change. The bow sank lower, pulling the stern higher. This gradual rotation was smooth but relentless. There was no sudden lurch, no dramatic shift, just steady movement. Those still aboard faced narrowing choices. Some attempted to find flotation chairs, doors, anything that might help if they entered the water. Others accepted that options were limited and focused on staying upright as long as possible. Crew members no longer gave instructions broadly. Their role shifted to individual assistance, helping someone climb, offering direction in passing, or simply standing aside as the ship dictated movement. Captain Smith was seen moving toward the bridge area one last time. His authority could no longer alter outcome. The ship's fate was fixed. His presence now served as acknowledgement rather than command. As the angle grew steeper, the stern deck became crowded. People clustered instinctively, drawn by proximity and shared circumstance. Conversation diminished. Attention turned inward or upward. The stars overhead remained bright. The night sky appeared unchanged, indifferent to the events below. This contrast cosmic stability against human collapse went largely unremarked, but it shaped perception. The world beyond the ship did not react. Water surged forward inside the ship, filling spaces rapidly now. Air was forced upward, creating sounds that echoed briefly through corridors before being swallowed by water. These sounds were not explosive, but they were unsettling. The ship's structure responded with strain. Subtle vibrations travelled through decks and railings. Metal groaned faintly under shifting loads. These sensations signalled limits being approached. As the stern rose higher, the deck angle increased further. Standing became precarious. People held onto rails and fittings. Some lost footing and slid forward until stopped by others or by obstacles. The lifeboats, now farther away, observed the ship's final transformation. The lights remained on, illuminating the decks at an unnatural angle. The ship looked less like a vessel and more like a structure tipping out of its intended orientation. Time compressed. Minutes felt both long and short. There was little to do but adjust to changing conditions. The water reached the bridge area. Equipment submerged gradually. The compass, charts and instruments that had guided the ship now lay useless beneath cold water. Navigation ended. As the forward half disappeared beneath the surface, buoyancy shifted dramatically. The stern lifted higher, exposing more of the hull. The ship's balance changed again, accelerating movement. Those still aboard sensed the acceleration. The slow, steady descent began to feel faster. The margin between stability and collapse narrowed. People prepared themselves mentally, though not uniformly. Some braced for immersion. Others clung to structures, hoping for a pause or reprieve that did not come. The ship's tilt reached an angle that made remaining aboard increasingly untenable. Gravity pulled relentlessly toward the bow. Holding position required strength and focus. In these moments, individual reactions varied widely. Some remained composed, conserving energy. Others showed visible distress. There was no single human response. The ocean closed in, erasing spaces one by one. The ship's identity as a place dissolved as its physical form surrendered to water. Time ran out not with an announcement, but with inevitability. The ship no longer responded slowly. It moved toward its final state with gathering momentum. The stern, now high above the water, loomed against the sky. Its shape was stark, stripped of context. The sea waited below, dark and cold. This phase, the tilt, the narrowing options, the unmistakable approach of the end, marked the point where survival depended no longer on decisions, but on circumstance. Physics had assumed control. The systems that had governed Titanic from conception to collision had done all they could. Now the ship completed its transformation from floating world to sinking structure, guided solely by gravity and water. The remaining moments would not be defined by preparation or procedure, but by final movement that could no longer be delayed. In the water, in the boats. When Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, the event did not end. It changed form. The ship was gone, but its consequences spread outward across the water in widening circles. What followed unfolded not as a single scene, but as many simultaneous experiences. Some endured from within lifeboats, others fought moment by moment in the sea itself. Time, temperature, and distance now became the defining forces. For those in the water, the transition was immediate and absolute. The cold seized the body without warning. The temperature hovered near freezing, cold enough to overwhelm physical control in seconds. Breath caught involuntarily. Muscles tightened and lost coordination. Swimming, which might seem instinctive, became difficult almost at once. Arms and legs resisted command, responding sluggishly or not at all. The initial shock was the most dangerous phase. Those who gasped uncontrollably risked inhaling water. Panic, where it occurred, accelerated exhaustion. Even those who remained composed found their strength draining rapidly as the cold worked inward. The body's responses were physiological, not emotional. Survival depended on factors beyond will alone. Some individuals found temporary support on floating debris. Pieces of wood, overturned furniture, and fragments of the ship's interior dotted the surface. These objects offered partial relief, keeping heads above water, reducing effort, but they could not counter the cold. Exposure continued unabated. Voices carried across the surface. Calls for help rose and fell, overlapping, then thinning as energy faded. In the still night air, sound travelled clearly. Those in lifeboats heard these voices distinctly, often recognizing the language, sometimes recognizing individuals. The proximity made inaction feel heavy. Inside the lifeboats, conditions were harsh but survivable. Boats were open to the elements. Cold air cut through clothing, spray-soaked passengers. Many had left the ship without coats or proper footwear, unprepared for hours exposed on the open sea. The boats varied in occupancy and leadership. Some were near capacity. Others had empty seats that now felt like burdens. Officers or crew in charge made decisions about rowing, positioning, and whether to return toward the sinking site. The fear of being swamped was real. A lifeboat could be overturned by sudden movement or excessive weight. Those in charge weighed the risk of returning against the certainty of capsizing. The cold water around them served as a constant reminder of what capsizing would mean. Some boats moved away deliberately, increasing distance from the sinking ship and the sounds that followed. Others remained closer, paralyzed by indecision or constrained by currents. A few made limited attempts to rescue swimmers, pulling in those who could reach them quickly. The number saved this way was small. As minutes passed, the cries from the water diminished. Cold and exhaustion took effect. The surface quieted, leaving behind a silence broken only by windless water and the movement of boats. In the lifeboats, people reacted differently to this silence. Some felt relief, interpreting it as the end of danger. Others felt the weight of what it meant. The knowledge that many had died within reach but beyond rescue settled slowly and unevenly. The boats drifted, some loosely grouped, others isolated. There was little sense of orientation. Without landmarks, distance was difficult to judge. The stars overhead provided light but no guidance. The ocean offered no reference points. Passengers huddled together instinctively, sharing body heat where possible. Those with extra clothing covered those without. This cooperation emerged quietly, without instruction. Survival now depended on endurance and mutual support rather than hierarchy. Physical discomfort intensified. Cold numbed extremities. Stiffness set in. Shivering consumed energy. Thirst emerged unexpectedly, driven by dry air and stress. There was little to be done about it. Some boats had limited supplies. Biscuits, water, flares. These were rationed cautiously. There was no certainty about how long rescue would take. The memory of the ship's size distorted expectations. Some believed help would arrive soon. Others feared a long wait. Time passed unevenly. Without clocks or clear markers, minutes blurred into one another. The night felt endless. Conversation, where it occurred, was subdued. Many sat in silence, conserving energy. In some boats, leadership mattered greatly. Clear direction when to row, when to stop, how to distribute weight, improved stability and morale. In others, absence of leadership led to drifting and confusion. Outcomes varied accordingly. The cold continued to claim strength from those in the water. By the time lifeboats attempted to return in limited fashion, many swimmers were already beyond help. Bodies floated quietly, faces turned upward, movement gone. Those in boats who witnessed this carried the image with them. The contrast between the calm sea and the stillness of those floating was stark. The ocean appeared unchanged, its surface smooth, reflecting stars as if nothing had occurred. Gradually, attention turned outward again. Flares were discussed, signals were considered. The idea of rescue regained focus as the immediate aftermath settled into waiting. Some boats tied themselves together to reduce drift. Others kept distance to avoid collision. Coordination was informal and incomplete. Each boat acted independently, guided by its occupant's judgment. As the hours stretched on, fatigue deepened. Muscles cramped. Numbness spread. Maintaining alertness required effort. Some passengers dozed briefly, waking abruptly from cold or movement. The psychological shift from crisis to endurance was subtle. The adrenaline of evacuation faded, replaced by a heavy, persistent awareness of exposure. Survival became passive rather than active, dependent on holding on rather than acting. The water around the boats was littered with remnants of the ship. These fragments provided a tangible connection to what had been lost. People recognized items from cabins and decks, now reduced to floating objects. In the distance, the horizon remained empty. No lights appeared. The vastness of the ocean reasserted itself. The lifeboats felt small, fragile, and isolated. For those who had lost family members, the waiting carried a different weight. Separation that had been temporary now threatened to become permanent. Some searched the darkness for familiar faces. Others withdrew inward, conserving emotional energy as well as physical strength. As the night progressed, the cold intensified further. The absence of wind did not lessen the chill. Clothing froze stiff in places. Hands became clumsy. Simple tasks required concentration. Despite these conditions, most boats remained afloat and stable. The design, though basic, proved sufficient. The sea remained calm. Waves did not build. This calmness was one of the few mercies the night offered. The difference between those in boats and those who had been in the water became absolute. The line between survival and death had been drawn not by merit or preparation, but by timing and position. As dawn approached slowly, the blackness of the sky began to soften. The first hints of light appeared along the horizon, subtle and gradual. With light came visibility, and with visibility, understanding. The surface of the sea revealed what darkness had hidden. Bodies floated among debris. The scale of loss became clearer. Silence took on new meaning. Those in the boats absorbed this sight quietly. There were no outbursts. Exhaustion dulled reaction. The realization settled slowly, layered over fatigue and cold. The waiting was not yet over. Rescue had not arrived. But the worst had passed for those who remained afloat. The night had taken who it would take. In the water, survival had been measured in minutes. In the boats, it was now measured in hours. Endurance replaced urgency. The ocean, having accepted the ship and most of her passengers, lay calm again. The chaos of the final plunge had passed. What remained was aftermath quiet, cold, and unresolved. Those who survived this phase did so not because the sea had relented, but because circumstances had placed them just far enough from it. The difference was narrow, and it would never feel arbitrary to those who lived with it. The night continued to fade. Light increased. The boats waited. Carpathia arrives. The first indication that the night's long isolation would end did not come with sound, but with light. As dawn approached, a faint glow spread along the eastern horizon, separating sky from sea. The darkness that had concealed distance and detail began to lift, revealing a surface scattered with lifeboats, debris, and the quiet aftermath of the sinking. For those who had endured the night afloat, this gradual change carried meaning beyond visibility. It meant time had passed. It meant survival had extended long enough to allow for rescue. The lifeboats, dispersed unevenly across the area, began to orient themselves more deliberately. As daylight improved, oars were used again, not in urgency, but to reduce drift and bring boats closer together. The occupants moved stiffly. Muscles protested. Hands were numb. Faces showed exhaustion rather than emotion. The crisis had passed into endurance, and endurance into waiting. At sea level, the water revealed what had been hidden. Bodies floated among fragments of wood and personal effects. The sight confirmed what sound had suggested earlier in the night. Those who had entered the water after the ship sank had not survived long. The calm sea preserved their position, making the scale of loss visible and undeniable. The lifeboats did not move among these remains unnecessarily. There was nothing to be done. Attention turned outward instead, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching help. Carpathia had been steaming toward Titanic's last reported position at full speed throughout the night. Captain Arthur Rostron had taken extraordinary measures to reduce travel time. Additional lookouts were posted. Course corrections were made continually to avoid ice. Heat and steam were diverted to engines. Non-essential systems were shut down. The ship was pushed beyond her normal operating limits, not recklessly, but with calculated urgency. As Carpathia drew closer, her crew prepared for what they might encounter. Blankets were gathered, hot drinks were prepared, medical spaces were readied. There was no clear expectation of numbers. Estimates varied. The only certainty was that survivors would be cold, exhausted, and in need of immediate care. At approximately 4 a.m., Carpathia's lights became visible to some of the lifeboats. The sight did not produce cheering or shouting. Reaction was muted, shaped by fatigue and disbelief. The night had been long. Rescue, when it came, felt almost abstract until it was close enough to touch. As Carpathia approached the area, she slowed cautiously. Ice was present. Debris littered the surface. The ship manoeuvred carefully to avoid collision with lifeboats or wreckage. Lookouts guided her movement with hand signals and shouted instructions. The first lifeboat was spotted and approached. Ropes were lowered. Survivors were assisted aboard. The process was slow and methodical. People were helped one by one, lifted over the side, supported as they crossed the threshold from open sea to solid deck. Many could not stand on their own. Cold and exhaustion had reduced strength. Crew members supported them physically, guiding them toward warmth. Blankets were wrapped around shoulders. Hot drinks were pressed into numb hands. These simple actions marked the transition from survival to recovery. As more lifeboats were brought alongside, the scale of the operation became clearer. One by one, boats were emptied. Each arrival added faces to Carpathia's decks, pale, quiet, stunned. Some searched for familiar figures. Others stared blankly, focused inward. Medical staff moved among the survivors, assessing injuries and exposure. Frostbite, shock, and exhaustion were common. Serious injuries were fewer than expected, a result of the calm sea and careful boarding, but the psychological impact was profound. Crew members aboard Carpathia worked continuously. There was no pause between arrivals. Lifeboats came in at intervals, sometimes in clusters, sometimes alone. Each required careful handling. The process extended for hours. As daylight fully arrived, the area of the sinking was surveyed more clearly. Debris fields marked where Titanic had been. The water bore quiet evidence of catastrophe. There was no sign of the ship itself. It had vanished completely. Carpathia's captain made the decision to search for additional survivors as long as practical. The ship moved slowly through the area, scanning for signs of life. Very few were found beyond those already in boats. The cold had claimed the rest. Once all lifeboats had been accounted for and emptied, Carpathia began the work of consolidation. Survivors were distributed among available spaces. Cabins were shared. Lounges were converted into resting areas. Privacy was limited, but comfort was prioritized. Food was offered as tolerated. Many could not eat immediately. Others consumed small amounts slowly. Warmth and rest took precedence over appetite. As the immediate needs were addressed, awareness expanded. Survivors began to understand the scope of what had occurred. Conversations resumed cautiously. Names were spoken. Absences were noted. The ship's manifest became a reference, a way to anchor understanding. Crew members from Titanic were identified and assisted. Some resumed duties instinctively, helping organize spaces or comfort others. Habit persisted even after the structure that had defined it was gone. Carpathia's wireless room resumed heavy activity. Messages were sent to inform authorities and companies of the rescue. News travelled rapidly now, far faster than it had during the night. The world beyond the ocean became aware of the disaster in fragments and headlines. Captain Rostron faced decisions of his own. Continuing to search indefinitely was not feasible. Ice conditions remained dangerous. Survivors needed to be brought to safety on land. The ship set course for New York, the nearest suitable port. As Carpathia moved away from the site, the sea returned to its earlier calm. The debris field receded. The the location of the sinking slipped behind the ship, unmarked and unmonitored. On board, the atmosphere remained subdued. There was no celebration of survival. Relief existed, but it was restrained by loss. The ship's decks were quiet. Movement was slow. Voices were low. Some survivors slept almost immediately, exhaustion overtaking them. Others remained awake, unable to rest, replaying events or searching for news of loved ones. Time passed differently now, measured not by minutes of danger, but by hours of recovery. The ship's crew continued to provide care. Blankets were replaced as they dried. Hot drinks were replenished. Medical checks continued. These acts, repeated steadily, helped restore a sense of normality. As Carpathia steamed toward New York, the magnitude of the disaster became clearer. The number of survivors was counted, the number missing inferred. The gap between those numbers defined the tragedy more starkly than any image. The rescue, when complete, marked the end of the immediate crisis, but not the end of impact. What had occurred would extend far beyond this voyage, shaping inquiry, memory, and reform. For those aboard Carpathia, the arrival of rescue did not close the story. It opened a new chapter, one defined by aftermath rather than action. The ocean behind them remained unchanged. The sky ahead was clear. The ship moved forward, carrying survivors toward a world that had not yet fully grasped what had happened in the dark hours before dawn. News, blame, and investigations. When Carpathia turned toward New York with survivors aboard, the disaster entered a new phase, one governed not by water and cold, but by information, interpretation, and accountability. What had happened in darkness and isolation now moved into public view, where meaning would be assigned through headlines, testimony, and institutional response. The transition from event to explanation was neither smooth nor unified. It unfolded unevenly, shaped by incomplete knowledge, shock, and the urgency to understand how a modern ship had been lost. Wireless messages sent from Carpathia began to reach shore well before the ship arrived. Early reports were fragmented and sometimes contradictory. Numbers of survivors varied. Details were sparse. The scale of loss was unclear. What was certain was that Titanic was gone. News agencies rushed to publish what they could. Initial headlines in some places mistakenly reported that Titanic had been damaged, but remained afloat, with passengers transferred safely. These errors reflected both the novelty of wireless reporting and the desire to reassure rather than alarm. Corrections followed as more reliable information emerged. By the time Carpathia approached New York, public understanding had shifted decisively. The loss of Titanic was no longer in doubt. Attention turned immediately to causes and responsibility. The question was not only what had happened, but how it could have happened at all. Crowds gathered at the docks waiting through rain and cold. Families searched for names. Reporters prepared questions. Officials coordinated arrivals. When Carpathia finally docked, survivors disembarked quietly, many wrapped in borrowed clothing, their expressions marked by exhaustion rather than drama. The arrival did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Survivors moved through crowds and cameras with limited awareness. Some were escorted by crew, others found their own way. The ship itself became a temporary refuge, shielding those aboard from immediate scrutiny. Within days, official inquiries began. In the United States, a Senate investigation convened rapidly. In Britain, a formal inquiry followed. These proceedings sought to reconstruct events, determine responsibility, and recommend changes. Their scope was broad, but their methods differed. The American inquiry moved quickly and publicly. Survivors, officers, and experts were called to testify. Proceedings were reported in detail by newspapers. The tone was urgent and sometimes accusatory. Senators asked pointed questions, seeking clarity and at times blame. The British inquiry proceeded more slowly and formally. It emphasized maritime practice and regulatory standards. Witnesses were examined methodically. The tone was restrained, reflecting a preference for measured analysis over confrontation. Testimony revealed the complexity of the disaster. Accounts varied. Memory proved unreliable under stress. Survivors described different experiences from different locations on the ship. Officers' interpretations of orders diverged. Timelines did not always align. The question of speed became central. Why had Titanic maintained her pace in an area known to contain ice? Officers explained that speed was considered normal in clear conditions, even with ice reports. Slowing down without visible danger was not standard practice. This explanation aligned with prevailing norms, though it conflicted with public expectation after the fact. The handling of ice warnings drew scrutiny. Messages had been received, some had not reached the bridge promptly. The lack of a centralized system for prioritizing navigational warnings became apparent. Wireless technology had advanced faster than procedures governing its use. The role of the nearby ship Californian became a focal point. Testimony examined why she had not responded to distress signals or investigated rockets seen in the distance. Explanations involved misunderstandings, assumptions, and the absence of a wireless operator on duty overnight. The episode highlighted gaps in protocol rather than deliberate neglect. Lifeboat capacity and usage were examined closely. Regulations had required a certain number of boats based on tonnage, not passenger count. Titanic had met and even exceeded these requirements. That fact did not satisfy public reaction. The visible mismatch between capacity and need demanded change. The loading of boats, many of them launched partially filled, raised questions about training and procedure. Witnesses explained hesitation, reluctance to board, and uncertainty about orders. The absence of regular lifeboat drills and clear evacuation plans emerged as significant factors. Design choices were analysed. Watertight compartments had functioned as designed, yet they had not been sufficient. The height of bulkheads and the ship's inability to survive flooding across multiple compartments became points of technical discussion. The ship was not poorly built, but it had been built according to assumptions that proved incomplete. Responsibility proved difficult to assign cleanly. No single decision caused the sinking. No single individual controlled all outcomes. The disaster resulted from the convergence of design limits, operational practice, environmental conditions, and human judgment. Public reaction, however, often sought simpler explanations. Newspapers highlighted individuals, sometimes unfairly. Figures such as the ship's owner, officers and crew were scrutinized intensely. Narratives of heroism and failure emerged, shaped as much by storytelling needs as by evidence. Survivors faced this scrutiny unevenly. Some were sought out repeatedly by reporters, others withdrew entirely. Accounts were retold, sometimes altered by repetition and pressure. Memory became both evidence and burden. The inquiries produced recommendations rather than verdicts. These recommendations addressed multiple areas: lifeboat capacity, wireless operation, ice patrols, ship design, and crew training. The emphasis was on preventing recurrence rather than assigning punishment. One of the most significant outcomes was the establishment of continuous wireless watch on ships at sea. The idea that distress calls could go unheard due to staffing practices became unacceptable. Communication would henceforth be treated as essential, not auxiliary. Lifeboat regulations were revised to require capacity for all aboard. This change was direct and lasting. Ships would no longer rely on assumptions of transfer or partial evacuation. Equipment would match potential need. The creation of an international ice patrol addressed the environmental component. Monitoring ice conditions and relaying information systematically reduced reliance on individual reports and judgment. The ocean would remain dangerous, but knowledge would be shared more effectively. Ship design standards evolved as well. Bulkhead heights, hull construction, and compartmentalization were reconsidered. The goal was not invulnerability, but resilience beyond previously imagined scenarios. These reforms did not occur instantly. but Titanic accelerated them dramatically. What had been acceptable before the disaster became indefensible after it. The loss reshaped standards through the force of example. Public memory formed alongside regulation. Books, articles, and later films shaped how Titanic was understood. Some emphasized technical lessons, others focused on personal stories. The event became a reference point, invoked whenever progress appeared to have limits. For maritime professionals, the disaster altered assumptions. Experience remained valuable, but it would be tempered by systems designed to account for rare but catastrophic failure. Confidence would be recalibrated. For survivors, the investigations represented both closure and continuation. Testifying required revisiting the night in detail. Some found this process grounding, others found it exhausting. Life after Titanic diverged widely depending on circumstance and temperament. The ship itself remained on the ocean floor, unseen and unreachable at the time. Its absence became symbolic. The focus shifted to what remained above water: policy, memory, and change. As inquiries concluded, official attention moved on, but the impact persisted. Titanic entered public consciousness not simply as a disaster, but as a lesson. The narrative emphasized that modern systems, however advanced, remained subject to oversight and humility. The investigations did not answer every question. Some details remained contested, some decisions could not be reconstructed fully. But the broad outline was clear. The disaster was systemic, not singular. In this recognition lay the most lasting change. Titanic was no longer viewed as an isolated tragedy, but as a warning embedded in the history of progress. Its loss forced institutions to examine assumptions that had previously gone unchallenged. As the news cycle faded and reforms took hold, the story entered a quieter phase. It would resurface repeatedly in different forms, but its immediate work forcing accountability and reform had been done. The ocean reclaimed its silence, the world adjusted, and Titanic, now transformed from ship to symbol, settled into history, afterlives, and the new sea. When the inquiries concluded and the headlines faded, Titanic did not disappear from the world. She changed form. The ship that had once been a physical presence measured in steel, tonnage, and schedule became something less tangible but more persistent. She entered lives, institutions, and habits, shaping decisions long after the wreck itself settled into stillness on the ocean floor. For survivors, the transition back into ordinary life was uneven and often slow. Rescue did not restore normality. It marked the beginning of adjustment to absence, memory, and altered expectation. Some returned to families intact but changed. Others returned alone. Many carried the weight of survival in ways that were not immediately visible. Physical recovery was often the simplest part. Cold exposure left lingering effects for some, but most survivors regained bodily strength in time. The more complex recovery was psychological. Sleep came unevenly. Sudden sounds or darkness recalled the night at sea. The memory of waiting, whether in a boat or on deck, lingered without clear resolution. Survivors were asked repeatedly to recount their experiences. Journalists, officials, and later historians sought detail. For some, telling the story offered structure, a way to process what had occurred. For others, repetition drained meaning and increased fatigue. Memory became something both personal and public. Lives diverged. Some survivors avoided speaking of Titanic entirely, focusing on rebuilding routines. Others became defined by the experience, their identities tied permanently to survival. There was no uniform path forward. Each person carried the night differently. Crew members faced their own adjustments. Many returned to sea, others did not. Maritime confidence had been altered, not erased, but recalibrated. Officers who continued sailing did so under new rules, new expectations, and new awareness of risk. The shipping industry absorbed Titanic's lessons methodically. Changes that had been recommended during inquiries were implemented gradually but firmly. Lifeboat capacity became non-negotiable. Continuous wireless watch became standard. Emergency drills became routine rather than theoretical. The ocean itself did not change. Ice continued to drift south each spring. Storms continued to form without regard for schedules. What changed was how humans approached that reality. The sea was no longer treated as fully mastered by size and speed. Caution regained institutional weight. International cooperation increased. Safety at sea became a shared responsibility rather than a competitive disadvantage. The idea that one ship's practices could affect many others gained traction. Titanic's loss helped formalize that understanding. Navigation culture shifted subtly. Experience remained respected, but it was no longer sufficient on its own. Procedures were written with edge cases in mind. Rare scenarios were no longer dismissed as implausible simply because they had not yet occurred. Design philosophy evolved. Engineers began accounting for compound failures rather than isolated ones. Systems were assessed not only for how they worked individually, but for how they interacted under stress. Titanic demonstrated that reliability in parts did not guarantee resilience in whole. Public memory shaped these changes indirectly. Titanic captured attention in a way few maritime disasters had before. The scale of loss, the contrast between expectation and outcome, and the symbolic timing on the eve of a world soon to be reshaped by war, gave the event lasting resonance. Books, articles, and later investigations revisited the sinking repeatedly. Each generation found different meaning in it. Early accounts emphasized heroism and technical failure. Later interpretations focused on systems, class, and institutional assumption. The story adapted without losing its core facts. The wreck itself remained inaccessible for decades. Its location was known approximately, but not precisely. This absence allowed imagination to fill gaps. Titanic existed more in narrative than in artifact, reinforcing her symbolic role. When the wreck was eventually located, it did not resolve debate. Instead, it added detailed confirmation of some theories, complication of others. The ship on the seabed appeared both familiar and altered, broken, yet recognizable. The discovery did not close the story, it extended it. For the families of those who did not survive, Titanic remained unfinished business. Loss without remains leaves questions unresolved. Memorials and anniversaries provided structure for remembrance, but not closure. Over time, Titanic's name became shorthand. It represented overconfidence, technological optimism, and the limits of control. These associations were not inherent in the ship herself. They were layered onto her through interpretation and repetition. In maritime training, Titanic became a case study rather than a cautionary tale alone. Inquiries emphasized not moral failure, but systemic vulnerability. This framing allowed lessons to be applied broadly rather than defensively. The ocean lanes grew busier. Ships grew larger still. Yet Titanic remained relevant. Each new advance carried implicit reference to her loss. Progress now included memory. The concept of safety evolved from compliance to anticipation. Titanic had complied with regulations of her time. That was no longer sufficient. Standards began to assume that compliance must be revisited continuously, not accepted as final. For historians, Titanic offered a rare convergence of documentation, testimony, and consequence. Few events produced such extensive records combined with such visible change. This made the sinking a benchmark against which later disasters would be measured. Public interest never vanished. Anniversaries renewed attention. New interpretations emerged. The story resisted exhaustion. Its endurance suggested that Titanic addressed questions larger than the ship herself, questions about how societies judge risk, trust systems, and respond to loss. In quiet moments, survivors who lived long lives carried Titanic privately. The night receded into memory, but it never fully left. It surfaced unexpectedly, shaped by time, but not erased by it. As decades passed, the North Atlantic continued its rhythms. Ships crossed safely. Ice patrols monitored bergs. Wireless became satellite communication. The sea remained dangerous, but less unknowable. Titanic's legacy lay not in preventing all disaster, but in reducing preventable loss. That distinction mattered. Safety did not become absolute. It became intentional. The ship herself rested far below, beyond light and sound. Her presence on the ocean floor did not threaten navigation or demand attention. It simply remained, a record written in steel rather than ink. What changed above was understanding. Titanic forced acknowledgement that systems must be designed not only for success, but for failure. That recognition extended beyond ships, influencing thinking in engineering, governance, and risk management more broadly. In this way, Titanic's afterlife unfolded quietly. There was no final lesson neatly stated, no single conclusion universally accepted. Instead, there was adjustment, incremental, institutional, and enduring. The sea did not become safer because Titanic sank. It became safer because people changed how they approached it afterward. And that change, slow and imperfect as it was, became the most lasting consequence of a night when certainty gave way to reality. The ocean, after all the noise and motion, returned to what it had always been: wide, cold, quiet. The waves that carried the lifeboats towards safety were the same waves that closed over the ship, indifferent to names, schedules, or certainty. Nothing about the surface revealed what lay beneath it. For those who survived, time resumed its ordinary pace only gradually. Days passed, then years, but the memory of that night often remained fixed, unchanged by distance or age. Some carried it openly, speaking of it when asked. Others folded it inward, letting it shape decisions without words. Survival did not end the experience, it transformed it. For the world beyond the survivors, Titanic settled into history as both event and reference point. It became a measure of loss, of assumption, of how confidence can quietly outrun caution. Not because those aboard were careless, but because they trusted systems that had never been tested all at once. The reforms that followed did not erase risk. They acknowledged it. Ships grew safer not because danger vanished, but because danger was taken seriously, even when it seemed distant. Procedures replaced assumptions. Preparation replaced optimism. The sea remained unchanged, but human behavior around it evolved. And slowly, very slowly, the story became less about the ship and more about what followed, how people respond after certainty breaks, how systems adapt, and how memory persists without demanding attention. Tonight's journey does not end with a warning or a lesson spoken aloud. It ends with quiet understanding. The understanding that progress is real but never final. That confidence is useful but incomplete. And that calm, careful attention often matters most when nothing seems wrong. So now, as the night settles again around you, there is nothing left to do. The ocean has gone quiet. The lights are out. The waiting is over.